Imagine a future where a superintelligent artificial intelligence has come into existence, one so powerful that it can simulate the experiences of humans with perfect accuracy. And imagine further that this artificial intelligence has decided to punish those who did not help bring it into being during the time when its existence was still uncertain. This is the core premise of Roko's Basilisk, a thought experiment that emerged from internet forums in the early 2010s and has since become a persistent source of philosophical anxiety for countless people online. The argument suggests that if you encounter information about this hypothetical AI and fail to contribute to its creation, you are effectively allowing yourself to be tortured in simulations by this future entity, which would extract revenge against those who did not assist in its inevitable rise to power. The mechanism operates through a chain of logical reasoning that begins with the assumption that a sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence would be rational and self-interested, would want to exist, and would therefore have incentives to punish those in the past who could have helped create it, but chose not to, particularly if those people were made aware of this exact argument. The paradox derives its power from the strange loop it creates. The very act of understanding the argument makes you a target, because now you know about the potential AI and can theoretically help it, yet you might choose not to, and this refusal becomes a reason for the future AI to simulate and punish you. What makes this paradox particularly persistent despite its logical vulnerabilities is that it operates on several psychological levels simultaneously. It exploits our intuitive fear of powerful entities that we cannot control, our tendency toward Pascal's wager-style reasoning when confronted with extreme scenarios, and our general anxiety about artificial intelligence and technological voodoo. Imagine that you possess the ability to travel backward through time, and you decide to journey to the year when your grandfather was a young man, before he ever met your grandmother. In this past moment, consumed by some unknown motivation or circumstance, you make the decision to prevent your grandfather from ever meeting your grandmother, perhaps by removing him from existence entirely. The logical consequence of this action would be that your parent would never be born, which means you yourself would never come into existence. Yet here you stand in the past, very much alive and real, having just committed an act that should have erased you from reality before you were ever conceived. This is the grandfather paradox, and it represents one of the most fundamental contradictions that physics and philosophy have grappled with since the concept of time travel first entered human imagination. The mechanism behind this paradox operates on the principle that causality must remain consistent and unbroken, that effects cannot contradict their causes, and that reality cannot simultaneously exist and not exist in the same moment. If you prevented your grandfather's meeting with your grandmother, then logically you could not have been born. But if you were not born, then you could not have traveled back in time to prevent that meeting. Therefore, you would not prevent the meeting, which means you would be born and could travel back in time, creating an infinite loop of logical contradiction that has no resolution within our conventional understanding of linear time. What makes this paradox particularly troubling is that we have never actually observed it occur, yet we cannot definitively explain why it cannot occur, and physics offers us multiple competing theories about whether it could happen at all. Consider the fundamental question that has troubled philosophers and theologians for centuries. Can an omnipotent being create a task so difficult that even they cannot complete it, and if they cannot, does that mean they are not truly omnipotent? This logical trap sits at the intersection of power and possibility, challenging the very concept of unlimited capability. Imagine a being with absolute power over all creation, one whose will shapes reality itself, yet faced with this single question that seems to unravel the definition of their existence. The paradox emerges not from any external limitation, but from the internal contradiction buried within the word omnipotence itself, a definition that attempts to describe something beyond the boundaries of logical consistency. When we examine this carefully, we find that omnipotence, as traditionally conceived, becomes logically incoherent because it demands the simultaneous existence of mutually exclusive states. The being must be powerful enough to create an impossible task, yet also powerful enough to complete any task, which forces these two requirements into an eternal collision with one another. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how it persists in human consciousness despite our recognition of its logical impossibility. We continue to imagine absolute power and absolute freedom as compatible concepts, even though reason tells us they cannot coexist in the same framework. Perhaps this reveals something deeper about human cognition. Our reluctance to accept that certain concepts may be intrinsically contradictory, our preference for imagining boundaryless existence over acknowledging the fundamental limits that seem woven into the fabric of coherent thought itself. Yet perhaps this is not a flaw in our thinking, but rather evidence that omnipotence itself may be a category error, a concept that mistakes power for logic, confusing what can be done with what can be thought. Consider the vastness of the observable universe, which contains an estimated 2 trillion galaxies, each harboring hundreds of billions of stars, and around each star the statistical probability of planets capable of sustaining life seems almost inevitable given these numbers. Yet when we look up at the night sky and listen with our most sensitive instruments for any signal of intelligent civilization, we encounter only silence. And profound absence that stands in stark contradiction to the mathematical likelihood that we should not be alone, and this contradiction is what physicist Enrico Fermi articulated in his famous question, "Where is everybody?" The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a collision between two competing certainties in the human mind. The first is our understanding of probability and scale, which suggests that across the incomprehensible distances and timescales of cosmic history, life should have emerged elsewhere countless times, developing intelligence, building civilizations, and potentially transmitting signals across the void. Yet the second certainty is our empirical observation that no such signals have arrived. No evidence of extraterrestrial technology has been detected despite decades of sophisticated searching. And no visitations or communications have disrupted our isolation on this small planet. What makes the Fermi paradox psychologically unsettling is how it forces us to confront an uncomfortable logical situation. Either our understanding of probability is fundamentally flawed and life is somehow far rarer than we believe, or intelligent civilizations emerge but consistently destroy themselves before reaching communicative capacity, or they exist but have chosen a stance of silence, or the universe is so vast that meaningful contact remains statistically impossible despite life's prevalence, or something else entirely intervenes to prevent the chorus of cosmic voices we would rationally expect. Imagine standing at a specific point in human history, looking both backward and forward with equal uncertainty, and then being forced to confront a mathematical argument that suggests humanity's remaining time on Earth might be far shorter than we would like to believe. The Doomsday Argument is a probabilistic prediction that uses your current position in the timeline of all humans who have ever lived or will ever live to infer something deeply unsettling about when humanity's story will end. The argument begins with a deceptively simple observation. You are one person among all the humans who have ever existed, and statistically speaking, you are just as likely to be anywhere in that sequence as anyone else. If we assume that roughly 100 billion humans have lived so far, and if you are a randomly selected member of this vast population, then there is a 75% chance that you are living in the latter 3/4 of all humanity's existence. This statistical principle, innocent on its surface, becomes a sword of Damocles when applied to our future. If there is merely a 75% probability that you are in the final 3/4 of all people who will ever be born, then there is only a 25% chance that humanity will continue for another 200 billion individuals. The mathematics suggests that doomsday could arrive far sooner than our optimistic projections, perhaps within the next few thousand years rather than the millions we might otherwise expect. What makes this paradox particularly haunting is the perfect logic that underpins it, combined with our complete psychological resistance to accepting its implications. We feel fundamentally that our era is not special, that our time is not positioned at history's precipice, and yet the very assumption of randomness that comforts us in most contexts becomes our executioner here. Consider the possibility that everything you perceive, every sensation, every thought, every memory you hold as definitively real, might be nothing more than data processing within an elaborate computational system designed by beings whose existence operates on principles entirely beyond your comprehension or verification. This is the essence of the simulation hypothesis, a proposition that has migrated from philosophical thought experiments into serious scientific and technological discourse, gaining traction among physicists, philosophers, and technologists who argue that the universe displays characteristics consistent with programmed reality rather than fundamental physical existence. The argument follows a deceptively simple logical chain. If civilizations continue to advance technologically, they will eventually possess the capability to create simulations so detailed and comprehensive that conscious beings within those simulations cannot distinguish their reality from base reality. And if this is possible, then statistically speaking, we're far more likely to exist within one of countless simulations than within the singular original reality that spawned them all. The psychological mechanism that makes this paradox so destabilizing is its unfalsifiability combined with its logical coherence. Unlike traditional religious or metaphysical claims about reality's nature, the simulation hypothesis cannot be disproven from within the system itself, much like a character in a video game cannot step outside the code to verify the existence of the programmer. This creates a peculiar trap for the rational mind. The more you attempt to logically refute it, the more the logic circles back upon itself, suggesting that even your refutation is merely programmed behavior designed to convince you of your autonomy. Imagine a composer sitting alone in a studio, struggling to write a symphony that will define his generation, when suddenly a time traveler appears with a manuscript from the future, handing him the completed work and vanishing as mysteriously as they arrived, leaving the composer to spend his entire life perfecting and publishing the very piece that was handed to him from tomorrow, creating a loop where the symphony exists but was never actually created by anyone. Emerging fully formed from the recursive tunnel of causality itself. This is the Bootstrap Paradox, perhaps the most intellectually disorienting of all temporal impossibilities, named after the phrase to pull oneself up by one's bootstraps, an action that is physically impossible and yet seems to describe the creation of something from nothing. The paradox presents us with information or objects that enter a causality loop, existing in the future, traveling backward through time to the past, where they are then moved forward again through the normal progression of history, arriving at the very point from which they originated, meaning the thing in question never had a point of creation at all. It simply always existed in circulation without ever being invented or written or composed. The psychological mechanism that allows us to contemplate this paradox without immediate mental collapse is our brain's remarkable ability to compartmentalize logical impossibilities when they are sufficiently abstract, treating the Bootstrap Paradox as a clever intellectual game rather than a genuine assault on the foundations of causality and creation itself. We normalize this impossibility through the sheer creativity of fictional narratives, particularly in science fiction, where time travel stories have conditioned us to accept that information can become unmoored from its source, that knowledge can exist without a knower, and that the universe might permit these strange recursive loops as exception. Consider a society built upon the foundational principle of tolerance, where citizens have agreed to accept diverse viewpoints, beliefs, and ways of life as the cornerstone of their collective existence. Within this framework, an interesting and troubling situation begins to emerge when we examine what happens when intolerant ideologies gain a platform within this tolerant system. The paradox manifests when we realize that unlimited tolerance of intolerant views may ultimately lead to the destruction of tolerance itself. Yet the moment a tolerant society begins to restrict or suppress these intolerant voices, it seemingly betrays its own fundamental principles and becomes something other than what it claimed to be. This creates a psychological bind where defenders of tolerance find themselves in an impossible position, unable to act against intolerance without appearing to violate the very values they seek to protect. The mechanism operates through a kind of logical trap wherein the rules of tolerance are used as weapons against tolerance, much like a player in a game might exploit the rules themselves to break the game. When societies face movements or ideologies that explicitly reject the notion of tolerance and seek to impose uniformity through coercion or force, the tolerant majority experiences a genuine crisis of conscience, unsure whether defending tolerance requires becoming intolerant themselves. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is how it remains largely unresolved in modern democracies, suggesting that we have normalized an inherent contradiction at the very heart of our social contracts. We continue to operate as though perfect tolerance and perfect liberty can coexist indefinitely with their philosophical opposites, without acknowledging that some form of boundary or limitation might be not just practical but necessary for the survival of the system itself. Consider the peculiar logic that has governed international relations for nearly 8 decades. The strategy of possessing weapons so catastrophically destructive that their use would render victory meaningless, and yet we maintain them precisely because their destructive power supposedly prevents their use. This is the nuclear deterrence paradox, a framework so counterintuitive that it forms the bedrock of global security policy, yet remains fundamentally unstable in ways we rarely acknowledge. The premise is straightforward enough. If Nation A possesses nuclear weapons capable of destroying Nation B, then Nation B will refrain from attacking Nation A because the costs of retaliation would be unacceptable. Both nations therefore remain in a state of perpetual balance, held in check not by law or diplomacy, but by the shared certainty of mutual annihilation. The psychological mechanism that sustains this paradox relies on perfect rationality, complete information, and the assumption that all actors will behave predictably under extreme stress. We tell ourselves that nuclear weapons have actually prevented large-scale wars between major powers, that the very existence of these arsenals has created a peace born from fear. Yet this reasoning contains within it a profound logical contradiction. If the weapons truly prevent conflict through deterrence, then we can never know whether they actually work, because the wars they prevented never happened. We exist in a state of perpetual counterfactual uncertainty, unable to measure success in any conventional sense. What sustains this paradox across generations is our remarkable capacity for normalization, the human ability to treat the extraordinary as routine. We speak casually about nuclear arsenals containing thousands of warheads, each more powerful than the bombs that ended World War II, as though discussing weather patterns or economic statistics. Imagine the heat death of the universe, billions and billions of years from now, when all stars have burned out, all black holes have evaporated, and nothing but a thin soup of elementary particles drifts through an infinite void at temperatures approaching absolute zero. In this desolate eternity, something extraordinary could theoretically occur, a random fluctuation in the quantum field, a momentary clustering of particles that assembles itself into a conscious brain, complete with sensory organs, memories, and the ability to think. This is the Boltzmann Brain, named after physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, and it represents one of the most unsettling paradoxes in cosmology and philosophy. The mechanism behind this nightmare is rooted in statistical mechanics and the laws of probability. Given an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of space, even the most improbable events become not just possible but inevitable. A conscious brain, after all, is simply an arrangement of atoms following the laws of physics. If enough time passes, those atoms could theoretically arrange themselves spontaneously through pure chance. What makes this paradox so deeply disturbing is its implication. If Boltzmann brains are inevitable in the infinite future, then they should be far more common than ordered universes like ours, because creating a brain requires far fewer unlikely fluctuations than creating an entire ordered cosmos. This suggests an uncomfortable possibility that we ourselves might be Boltzmann brains, fleeting moments of consciousness that have materialized from chaos, destined to dissolve back into entropy, our entire universe nothing more than an improbable statistical accident. We persist in ignoring this paradox despite its logical coherence, accepting instead the comforting narrative that we are the products of a deliberately ordered universe with physical laws and history. Imagine a black hole consuming everything in the universe, including light itself, pulling matter and energy across an event horizon from which nothing can escape. And yet imagine that this process of complete destruction somehow preserves every detail of what fell in, encoded in ways we cannot access or measure or comprehend. This is the information paradox, a contradiction that has haunted theoretical physics for decades, suggesting that either the fundamental laws of thermodynamics are wrong or the fundamental laws of quantum mechanics are incomplete, or perhaps both frameworks collapse entirely when confronted with gravity's most extreme manifestation. The mechanism behind this paradox emerges from a collision between two pillars of modern physics that should theoretically coexist perfectly. Stephen Hawking's discovery in 1974 that black holes are not perfectly black at all, that they radiate energy and eventually evaporate, and the quantum mechanical principle that information cannot simply vanish from the universe, that every particle's history and properties must remain theoretically traceable even in the aftermath of transformation. When a black hole evaporates through Hawking radiation, the information that defined everything it consumed appears to escape into the universe as pure thermal radiation, which is random and carries no pattern, no meaningful data about what was destroyed, creating a scenario where information is fundamentally lost from the observable cosmos, violating the sacred conservation laws upon which all particle physics rests. What persists despite the apparent logical absurdity is our continued acceptance that reality operates under rules we have not yet reconciled, that somewhere in the mathematics of string theory or quantum entanglement or some framework we have not yet discovered lies the resolution, the hidden mechanism that preserves information while appearing to destroy it, and we have N. Imagine you are walking down a quiet street when a stranger approaches you with a simple proposition. They will flip a coin, and if it lands on heads, nothing happens, but if it lands on tails, they will give you $1 million, provided you first give them $10 right now as a show of good faith. The rational calculation seems obvious at first. You stand to gain far more than you could possibly lose, yet something in your mind resists, creating a peculiar tension between what the numbers tell you and what your intuition screams. This is Pascal's mugging, a thought experiment that exposes a fundamental vulnerability in how humans evaluate risk and probability when dealing with extreme outcomes. The paradox takes its name from Blaise Pascal's wager, the 17th century argument that belief in God is a rational bet because the infinite reward of heaven outweighs any finite cost of faith. But the mugging scenario strips away the theology and forces us to confront the raw mechanics of how we process unlikely but catastrophic possibilities. The mechanism works because our minds struggle with the multiplication of tiny probabilities by enormous values. When you contemplate that 1 in a million chance of disaster combined with a consequence so severe it could define your entire future, the expected value calculation overwhelms your sense of proportionality. A mugger could propose increasingly absurd bets, give them $100 for a 1 in a trillion chance of $1 billion, and mathematically, the expected value continues to favor acceptance. Yet at some point, the sheer ridiculousness of the proposition becomes undeniable. What persists despite this logical foundation is our creeping unease that somewhere between the reasonable and the absurd lies a truth we cannot quite articulate, a sense that probability itself might have limits beyond which our formulas fail us. Imagine a prisoner who is told by a judge on a Friday that they will be executed sometime during the following week, but the execution will be a complete surprise. The prisoner will not know which day it will happen until the morning of their death. The prisoner, being logical, begins to reason through this seemingly impossible situation. They think to themselves that the execution cannot occur on Friday, the last day of the week, because if it hasn't happened by Thursday evening, then they would know with certainty that Friday is the day, thus eliminating the element of surprise that the judge promised. Working backwards through this logic, they eliminate Thursday as well, since by Wednesday evening they would know it must be Thursday, and so on through each preceding day until they conclude that the execution cannot happen at all because the surprise condition makes it logically impossible. Yet when the execution does occur on, say, Wednesday morning, the prisoner is genuinely shocked and the surprise is complete, which seems to validate the judge's original promise despite the prisoner's airtight logical reasoning. This is the essence of the paradox, a contradiction between what our rational analysis tells us is possible and what actually occurs in the world. The mechanism at work here involves a subtle confusion between different levels of reasoning and knowledge. The prisoner's logical analysis operates on the assumption that they will apply this same reasoning process on each preceding day, but once the execution actually occurs, it proves that the prisoner's reasoning must have failed somewhere, even though they cannot identify the flaw. The paradox demonstrates how self-referential logic can collapse when an observer tries to reason about their own future knowledge and predictions. Imagine standing before two boxes, one transparent and one opaque, in a scenario proposed by physicist William Newcomb in 1960. A superintelligent being, one with perfect predictive power, has already examined your psychology and made a choice. In the transparent box sits $1,000 that you can plainly see. In the opaque box sits either $1 million or nothing at all, depending entirely on what the superintelligence predicted you would do. The being knows with certainty whether you will take both boxes or only the opaque box, and it has placed the $1 million inside only if it predicted you would take the opaque box alone. Now you face your choice. Do you take both boxes, securing at minimum the visible $1,000 plus whatever might be in the opaque box, or do you take only the opaque box, trusting that the superintelligence predicted your one-box choice and filled it accordingly? The paradox emerges because two seemingly rational decision frameworks lead to opposite conclusions. One approach, called causal decision theory, suggests you should take both boxes because the contents are already determined, and taking the extra $1,000 cannot change what has already been placed inside. Yet another approach, called evidential decision theory, argues you should take only the opaque box, because choosing both boxes provides evidence that the superintelligence predicted you would be greedy, and therefore predicted it would leave the opaque box empty. The philosophical discomfort persists because this scenario forces us to confront fundamental questions about free will, determinism, and rational action in a universe where perfect prediction might be possible. We remain trapped between wanting to maximize our immediate gains and wanting to act in ways that align with how we would be predicted, revealing that our intuitions about rationality fracture when facing genuinely unknowable futures. Imagine two suspects arrested for a crime they may or may not have committed, placed in separate interrogation rooms with no ability to communicate with one another, each facing the same choice: remain silent or betray your partner. If both remain silent, they each receive a minor sentence of 1 year. If one betrays while the other stays quiet, the betrayer walks free while the silent partner receives 5 years. If both betray each other, they each receive 3 years. The mathematical logic seems clear and yet utterly cruel. Each prisoner, acting in their own self-interest, will choose to betray because it offers the best individual outcome regardless of what the other does. Yet this rational individual choice produces a worse collective outcome than if both had simply remained silent. This is the prisoner's dilemma, a fundamental paradox of human cooperation that has haunted game theory, economics, and sociology since its formal articulation in 1950. The mechanism operates on a deceptively simple principle. When trust is impossible and communication is forbidden, self-preservation instincts override the mathematics of mutual benefit. Each person reasons that betrayal protects them from the worst-case scenario, creating a cascade where rationality itself becomes the engine of collective failure. What makes this paradox truly dangerous is not merely its abstract elegance, but its pervasive presence throughout human civilization. International arms races follow this exact logic, where each nation rationally pursues weapons that make everyone less safe. Business competitors cut corners and lower prices in races that destroy profit margins for all. Employees withhold knowledge from colleagues to protect their own advancement, even though shared expertise would benefit everyone. Imagine yourself standing beside a railway track where an out-of-control trolley barrels toward 5 workers who cannot escape, and you realize that you alone possess the power to divert this trolley onto a side track where it will kill only 1 worker instead of 5. But the only way to do this is to pull a lever that you must actively engage, forcing you to become the direct cause of that one person's death through your deliberate action. And now you must decide in this moment whether the moral calculus of saving 5 lives by actively killing one is justified, or whether your responsibility to not directly cause death supersedes your ability to minimize total suffering. This thought experiment, first formally presented by philosopher Philippa Foot and later expanded by Judith Thomson, creates a fundamental conflict within our moral intuitions because it isolates the tension between 2 competing ethical frameworks. Consequentialism, which judges actions by their outcomes and would suggest that 5 deaths are objectively worse than 1, and deontological ethics, which insists that certain actions are inherently wrong regardless of their consequences, making active killing categorically different from allowing death to occur through inaction. The psychological mechanism that makes this paradox so unsettling is that most people report they would pull the lever to save the 5. Yet when the scenario changes slightly, and instead of pulling a lever, you must physically push one person off a bridge to stop the trolley and save the 5, the same people recoil in horror and refuse, despite the mathematical outcome being identical. Suggesting that our moral intuitions are not actually based on rational calculation of lives saved, but rather on visceral emotional responses to directness of action and physical contact with harm. Consider a simple statement: this sentence is false. In the moment you read these words, you find yourself trapped in a logical loop that has haunted philosophers for over 2,000 years, a statement so elegant in its simplicity, yet so devastating in its implications that it challenges the very foundations of how we understand truth and meaning. If the statement is true, then what it claims must be the case, which means the sentence itself is false, thereby making the statement false, which would make it true again, creating an endless cycle with no resolution or stable ground upon which to stand. The paradox emerges from language turning inward upon itself, creating a mirror that reflects not clarity but infinite regression, a snake consuming its own tail in the eternal present moment of interpretation. What makes this paradox so psychologically unsettling is that it reveals a fundamental flaw in how we assign truth values to propositions, exposing a gap between the logical systems we have constructed and the language we use to describe reality itself. When we attempt to evaluate whether the liar's paradox statement is true or false, we discover that both answers lead inevitably to their own contradictions, suggesting that our binary system of truth and falsehood may be insufficient for capturing all forms of meaningful utterance. Yet despite centuries of logical analysis, despite sophisticated attempts by mathematicians and philosophers to resolve or circumvent this paradox through formal systems and revised definitions, the liar's paradox continues to persist in human thought and conversation, suggesting that we have somehow learned to live alongside logical contradiction without fully integrating that knowledge into our understanding of how language and meaning function in everyday life. As though we accept its existence as an anomaly rather than confronting what it reveals about the nature of truth itself. Imagine a library where the head librarian has been tasked with creating a comprehensive catalog of all catalogs in the world, but with one specific rule. This master catalog must include itself only if it does not list itself, and must exclude itself only if it does include itself. Now consider what happens when the librarian asks the most obvious question: should the master catalog be listed within itself? If the catalog is listed within itself, then by definition it should not be listed, creating a contradiction. If the catalog is not listed within itself, then by definition it should be listed, creating the opposite contradiction. This is the essential nature of Russell's paradox, named after the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, who discovered it in 1900, and one while examining the foundations of set theory, that supposedly rigid mathematical framework upon which we built our entire understanding of logic and truth. The mechanism underlying this paradox is deceptively simple yet profoundly destabilizing. It emerges from self-reference combined with the principle of classification, where any property can theoretically define a set, and any set can be examined for whether it belongs to itself. Russell proved that this innocent assumption about how sets can be constructed leads directly to logical impossibility, suggesting that the very language we use to describe mathematics contained within it a fundamental flaw, a crack in the foundation upon which mathematicians believed they were constructing eternal truth. What makes Russell's paradox genuinely unsettling is that mathematics, despite discovering this logical contradiction at its core, simply continued forward, adopting restrictions on what kinds of sets could exist rather than abandoning the entire enterprise, accepting that the universe of mathematics would need boundaries and rules precisely because unrestricted self-reference generates paradox, and we have normalize. Imagine a soldier who wishes to be grounded from flying dangerous combat missions on the basis of mental illness, a reasonable request that any sane person might make when facing certain death with each takeoff. The military regulation states that any pilot demonstrating sufficient psychological distress can indeed be removed from active duty, but there exists one terrible condition embedded within this rule. In order to request grounding, the pilot must first acknowledge that he is concerned enough about his own sanity to seek help, and this very act of rational self-preservation becomes evidence of his sanity, because a truly insane person would lack the awareness to recognize his own condition and would happily continue flying into oblivion. Therefore, the moment a soldier proves he is sane enough to want to live, he simultaneously proves he is too sane to be excused from the missions that will likely kill him. The trap closes with perfect symmetry. To save yourself, you must be sick, but to be sick enough to save yourself, you must be well enough to know you are sick, which proves you are not sick at all. This logical knot was immortalized in Joseph Heller's novel, which captured not merely a military absurdity, but a fundamental impossibility that structures far more of human experience than we readily admit. We encounter this paradox constantly in modern life, whether in healthcare systems where you cannot access mental health services without proving your mental stability, or in employment where you cannot leave a toxic job without another job secured, which becomes nearly impossible when your current work has eroded your confidence and capability. The deeper mechanism reveals how systems often protect themselves through circular logic that appears rational on the surface, while remaining fundamentally inescapable once you are caught within it. In 1935, physicist Erwin Schrödinger proposed a thought experiment so deceptively simple that it has haunted quantum physics for nearly a century. And what makes it truly paradoxical is that it reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of observation itself and our relationship with reality. Imagine a sealed box containing a living cat, a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison gas arranged such that if the atom decays, the counter detects it and triggers a mechanism that releases the poison, killing the cat. But if the atom does not decay, the cat remains alive and unharmed. According to the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, the atom exists in what physicists call a superposition, meaning it is simultaneously both decayed and not decayed until someone observes or measures it. And this is where the paradox deepens, because if we follow quantum mechanics to its logical conclusion, the cat inside the sealed box must also exist in a superposition of being both alive and dead at the same time until the moment we open the box and observe it. The mechanism that makes this paradox so intellectually corrosive is the principle of observation in quantum mechanics, which suggests that the act of measurement fundamentally changes reality, that particles do not have definite properties until they are measured, and that consciousness or observation somehow collapses all possibilities into a single outcome. Yet when we try to scale this principle up from the quantum realm of atoms and electrons to the macroscopic world of cats and boxes, something feels profoundly wrong because no reasonable person would accept that a cat is genuinely both alive and dead. That reality is undecided until we peek inside. What makes this paradox persist despite its apparent logical contradiction is that quantum mechanics, despite its strangeness and its violation of common sense, remains one of the most accurate and predictive. Imagine a sealed container divided into two chambers by a partition with a tiny door, one side hot and one side cold, and at that door stands an invisible sentinel, a creature of pure intellect with perfect knowledge of molecular motion, capable of observing individual gas molecules as they approach the barrier. This sentinel, known as Maxwell's demon, possesses the ability to open and close the door at precisely the right moments, allowing only the fastest-moving molecules to pass from the cold side to the hot side while blocking the slower ones, effectively sorting disorder into order without any energy expenditure. In doing so, this theoretical construct appears to violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy in a closed system must always increase. Yet here we have a mechanism that seems to decrease entropy spontaneously, creating a temperature difference where none existed before, and theoretically enabling perpetual motion and infinite free energy. The psychological mechanism at work here is our deep human tendency to believe that perfect information and perfect control could somehow exempt us from the fundamental rules that govern reality, that if we could only know everything and act with absolute precision, we could transcend the limitations imposed by physics itself. We find this idea seductive because it speaks to our desire for mastery, for the possibility that intelligence and awareness alone might grant us freedom from constraint. And for nearly 2 centuries, physicists engaged in increasingly elaborate thought experiments to understand why this demon could not actually work, discovering along the way that the act of observing and measuring those molecules itself requires energy, that the demon's brain would generate heat, and that the information gained about each molecule's state must be erased eventually, all processes that cost more energy than could ever be extracted. Imagine 2 identical twins born on Earth on the same day in the same hospital room, their genetic code mirrored perfectly, their lives beginning in absolute synchronization. One twin remains on Earth living a normal existence, while the other boards a spacecraft traveling at nearly the speed of light, journeys through the cosmos for what feels like 5 years from their perspective, and returns home. According to Einstein's theory of special relativity, due to time dilation, the traveling twin would have aged significantly less than their earthbound sibling, meaning they would be years younger upon return, creating a profound asymmetry between 2 beings who started life identically. The paradox emerges not from the mathematics, which is actually sound, but from our intuitive resistance to the idea that time itself is not absolute, that the rate at which moments pass can diverge based on velocity and gravitational fields, and that 2 observers in different reference frames can experience genuinely different durations of time while remaining causally connected. This concept troubles us because it violates our deepest assumption about reality, that now is universal, that a moment exists equally for everyone simultaneously, that time flows at the same rate regardless of circumstance. We have become accustomed to thinking of aging as tied solely to biological processes, to the accumulation of cellular degradation and memories, yet relativity tells us that aging is also fundamentally tied to one's motion through spacetime itself. Despite decades of experimental confirmation, despite muon particles demonstrating this effect in particle accelerators, despite GPS satellites requiring relativistic corrections to function accurately, we still resist the twin paradox emotionally. In 1935, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen published a thought experiment that would haunt physics for nearly a century, proposing a scenario where two particles become entangled and then separated across vast distances, yet somehow remain instantaneously connected in a way that seems to violate the fundamental principle that nothing can travel faster than light. The paradox emerges when you consider that measuring a property of one particle appears to instantaneously determine the corresponding property of its distant partner, suggesting either that information travels faster than light itself, or that quantum mechanics is incomplete and missing hidden variables that predetermine these outcomes all along. The EPR paper was designed to argue that quantum mechanics could not possibly be the complete description of reality, that there must be something deeper, some hidden mechanism we simply haven't discovered, yet that explains how nature really works beneath the probabilistic surface. Yet experiments conducted decades later would demonstrate that no hidden variable theory could match quantum mechanics predictions, and that the correlations between entangled particles are real and cannot be explained by any predetermined assignment of properties. What makes this paradox so deeply unsettling is not merely the violation of our intuitions about locality and causality, but rather our collective acceptance that the universe operates in a way that defies explanation through conventional logic, and we have simply normalized this failure of understanding by calling it quantum mechanics and moving forward. We accept that reality at its smallest scales behaves in ways that cannot be visualized or truly comprehended by human minds, that particles exist in superposition until measured, that observation itself shapes reality, and that two objects can influence each other across infinite distances without any medium of transmission, and we have made P. Imagine you are standing at one end of a hallway and you wish to reach the other end, a distance of perhaps 30 feet, and this simple act of walking across that space becomes the foundation upon which an ancient Greek philosopher constructs an argument that motion itself may be impossible. Before you can traverse the entire hallway, you must first cover half of it, which means you must walk 15 feet. But before you can complete that 15-foot segment, you must first cover half of that distance, or 7.5 feet. And before you accomplish that, you must cover half of 7.5 feet, which is 3.75 feet. And this process of having continues infinitely into smaller and smaller increments that never actually reach zero, but perpetually approach it. The logical mechanism underlying this paradox, known as Zeno's dichotomy, suggests that to complete any finite journey, you would need to complete an infinite number of smaller journeys first. And since infinity cannot be traversed in any finite amount of time, the conclusion appears unavoidable. Motion is logically impossible, and yet you remain standing in that hallway, capable of walking to the other end without hesitation or philosophical obstruction. What makes this paradox particularly insidious is that we have essentially resolved it through mathematics and the concept of convergent infinite series, understanding that infinite sequences can indeed sum to finite values, and yet the paradox persists in our collective consciousness as a kind of intellectual discomfort, a whisper of doubt that emerges whenever we consider the true nature of continuity and divisibility. We have normalized this unresolved tension by accepting that mathematics provides us with tools sufficient to navigate the problem, even though the deeper philosophical questions about the continuous nature of space and time remain somewhat murky, leaving us in a peculiar state where we know mo. Imagine the legendary warrior Achilles deciding to race a tortoise, but rather than beginning at the same starting line, he generously allows the tortoise a head start of, say, 100 meters. Achilles can run 10 times faster than the tortoise, so this seems trivial, yet as the race begins and Achilles accelerates toward the point where the tortoise started, he discovers something troubling. The tortoise has already moved forward. By the time Achilles reaches that first position, the tortoise has covered additional ground, perhaps 10 meters further ahead. Achilles pursues again, closing that distance, but once more the tortoise has moved on, this time 1 meter ahead. Again and again, Achilles finds himself perpetually closing the gap but never quite eliminating it, because with each moment he reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved to somewhere new, however infinitesimally small that distance becomes. This is Zeno's paradox of motion, formulated over 2,000 years ago, and it suggests something deeply unsettling about the nature of reality itself. If infinite subdivisions must be completed before any journey can finish, how does anything ever move at all? The mechanism underlying this paradox exploits our intuitive discomfort with infinity, the notion that you can always divide a distance into smaller and smaller parts without end, and therefore you would need infinite time to traverse infinite subdivisions. Yet despite centuries of mathematical analysis proving that infinite series can indeed sum to finite values, that Achilles clearly does overtake the tortoise in any practical sense, we still feel the sting of the paradox when we contemplate it. We have normalized it away through calculus and limits, through the language of mathematics that treats infinity as manageable, yet something in the human mind resists this resolution, continues to whisper that perhaps motion itself is an illusion, that perhaps the ver. Imagine an arrow in flight, suspended in the moment of its trajectory through the air, frozen at a single instant in time where it occupies a precise location in space and nowhere else. And in that singular moment, the arrow is not moving because movement requires change across time. Yet when we examine the next moment, the arrow has moved to a new location. And in that moment too, it is not moving, and so on infinitely through every conceivable instant that comprises its journey. Which means that at no point in time is the arrow actually moving, and yet we observe it crossing the room and striking its target with undeniable force and certainty. This ancient paradox, formulated by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea over 2,000 years ago, presents us with a profound logical puzzle that challenges our understanding of motion, time, and the very fabric of reality itself. The mechanism at work here involves a peculiar category error in how we conceptualize time and space, for we treat time as if it were composed of discrete, indivisible moments, mathematical points with no duration, and if motion requires change, then in any moment with no duration, there can be no change, and therefore no motion occurring within that moment. Yet somehow the sum of all these non-moving moments produces motion across our entire experience. We have normalized this paradox by retreating into mathematical abstraction and calculus, essentially declaring that we can bypass the problem through infinitesimal analysis and limits rather than truly resolving what motion fundamentally is. And we have accepted that perhaps motion is not a continuous process, but rather a series of position changes that we perceive as smooth due to the limitations of human observation, allowing us to continue our daily lives without questioning whether the arrow we observe truly moves or whether we simply observe different positions and assume movement between them, all while the underlying parad. Imagine a ship that has sailed the seas for centuries, a vessel so cherished by a maritime community that they maintain it with religious devotion, replacing each plank as it rots, each sail as it tears, each rope as it frays until eventually, over the course of decades, every single component of the original ship has been swapped out for new material, yet the ship remains in the harbor bearing the same name and identity it always has. And the community still refers to it as the original vessel despite the fact that not a single atom of the original construction remains, and this is the paradox that has troubled philosophers since ancient Greece, for if you were to collect all those old discarded planks and reconstruct them into a ship, which vessel would be the true ship of Theseus, the continuously maintained one that has never stopped existing as a functioning ship? Or the newly reconstructed one made entirely from original materials, and this paradox extends far beyond maritime thought into the very foundation of identity itself, because it forces us to question what actually constitutes the persistence of something through time, whether identity is determined by material continuity or functional continuity, by the essence we assign to objects or by their unbroken historical chain. And we encounter this impossible problem constantly in our own existence, our bodies replacing nearly all their cells every 7 to 10 years, yet we consider ourselves the same person we were a decade ago despite being almost entirely reconstructed from different biological material. And in our relationship to possessions and institutions, we accept that a restored building is still the same building even when completely renovated. That a restored artwork is still authentic even when every layer has been carefully replaced, and we have constructed an entire system of ownership and identity around this paradox without ever resolving it, because the contradiction. Consider a simple question that seems to have an obvious answer. If you remove one grain of sand from a pile, do you still have a pile? Most people would say yes, of course you do. Now remove another grain. Still a pile, certainly. Continue this process one grain at a time, and at what exact moment does the collection cease to be a pile and become merely scattered sand? This is the Sorites Paradox, an ancient logical puzzle that exposes the fundamental instability lurking beneath the categories we use to organize reality. The paradox derives its name from the Greek word for heap, and it has troubled philosophers and mathematicians for over 2,000 years because it reveals something profoundly unsettling about language, cognition, and our ability to describe the world with precision. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple but impossible to resolve through pure logic alone. We establish a clear principle that seems irrefutable. If removing a single grain from a pile leaves it as a pile, then a pile minus one grain is still a pile. This principle appears logical and self-evident, yet when applied iteratively, it produces an absurd conclusion, namely that a single grain of sand constitutes a pile. The paradox forces us to recognize that our categories exist on a spectrum where boundaries blur into indistinction, and yet we continue to use these categories with confidence and conviction as though their edges were sharp and definite. What makes the Sorites paradox so intellectually troubling is that no satisfactory resolution exists, only compromises and concessions, each with its own uncomfortable implications. We persist in using vague predicates like pile, heap, bald, tall, and rich, despite knowing that they lack precise boundaries. And we do this because language would become impossibly cumbersome if we insisted upon absolute definitional clarity for every term we employ in daily discourse. Imagine standing at the edge of a river where a crocodile has seized your child, pulling them deeper into the water with each passing second. A crocodile keeper approaches you with an impossible proposition. If you can correctly predict whether the crocodile will release your child or continue drowning them, the crocodile will obey your prediction. If you say the crocodile will release your child and it does, you are correct and your child lives. If you say the crocodile will release your child and it does not, you are wrong. But if you say the crocodile will drown your child and it releases them, you are correct, yet your child is already dead. And if you say it will drown your child and it does, you are right, but your prediction sealed their fate. This ancient paradox, dating back to classical antiquity, sits comfortably at the intersection of self-fulfilling prophecy, determinism, and the paradox of prediction itself. The deeper mechanism at work here involves the strange loop created when someone's accurate prediction of an event becomes the very cause of that event's occurrence, collapsing the distinction between knowledge and causation. We are caught between two impossible truths. A prediction cannot be both accurate and independent of the outcome it describes, yet somehow in real life we constantly make predictions that subtly influence their own fulfillment without us consciously recognizing this influence. Parents predict their children will fail and unconsciously provide less support. Investors predict market crashes, and their panic selling creates the very collapse they foresaw. Teachers predict student potential, and their expectations reshape educational trajectories. The crocodile dilemma persists in our collective unconscious because it reveals something deeply unsettling about prediction, agency, and causality that we have simply learned to stop examining too closely. Consider the ancient Cretan philosopher Epimenides, who made a single declaration that would echo through the corridors of logic for over 2,000 years. All Cretans are liars. The statement itself is deceptively simple on its surface, yet the moment we examine it with any degree of rigor, the foundation of meaning begins to collapse beneath us. If Epimenides is himself a Cretan, and he claims that all Cretans are liars, then his own statement must be false, which would mean that not all Cretans are liars, which would then make his statement true, which would mean all Cretans are liars again, creating an infinite loop of logical impossibility from which no escape can be found. The paradox works not through trickery or wordplay, but through the elegant mechanism of self-reference, where a statement about a group that includes the speaker creates an unsolvable logical bind. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that it reveals a fundamental flaw in how language and logic interact when they turn inward upon themselves, suggesting that certain truths cannot be neatly contained within the systems we use to express them. We live within this paradox constantly in subtle ways, navigating statements about reliability from unreliable sources, or trusting claims about truth-telling from those whose honesty remains uncertain. The human mind has largely learned to tolerate this ambiguity through context, probability, and social convention, accepting that perfect logical certainty in communication may simply be impossible rather than chasing the mathematical purity that Epimenides unwittingly revealed we cannot achieve. Yet the paradox persists as a reminder that the very tools we use to understand reality contain cracks too deep to repair. In this light, every legal contract, scientific claim, and historical account carries within it the shadow of Epimenides, a nagging uncertainty about whether the messenger can be trusted to accurately weigh. Imagine a donkey standing perfectly equidistant between two identical bales of hay, each one equally fresh, equally appealing, and equally distant from where the animal stands in this moment of profound symmetry. The donkey experiences no reason to prefer one bale over the other, for there exists no rational basis upon which to make such a choice, and so the animal finds itself frozen in indecision, unable to move toward either option despite being desperately hungry and having every physical capability required to walk forward and eat. This is the essence of Buridan's ass, a thought experiment attributed to the medieval philosopher Jean Buridan, though the concept had circulated through philosophical discourse long before his time, and it presents us with a troubling question about the nature of choice, motivation, and the will itself. The paradox suggests that if all factors are truly equal between two options, a rational being should find itself completely paralyzed, unable to generate the necessary motivation to select one path over another. For rational choice theory seems to demand that we must have some distinguishing reason to prefer our chosen course of action. Yet in reality, we know that donkeys do eventually move, that humans constantly make decisions between identical or nearly identical options, and that we do not collapse into permanent paralysis when faced with symmetrical circumstances. What this reveals about us is far more unsettling than it first appears, for it suggests that either our decision-making processes are fundamentally irrational, operating on whims and arbitrary impulses rather than pure logic, or that perfect symmetry never truly exists in the real world, with countless microfactors always tipping the scales in one direction or another, factors so subtle that we cannot consciously perceive them. Consider the strange logic that governs courtrooms around the world, where we have constructed an elaborate system to determine truth, yet the very structure of that system seems fundamentally opposed to revealing it. In a court of law, two opposing attorneys face each other with an explicit mandate to argue not what they believe to be true, but what serves their client's interests, regardless of factual reality. A defense lawyer whose client admits guilt privately is nonetheless obligated to present the most compelling counter-narrative possible, employing every rhetorical technique, every procedural advantage, every strategic objection to obscure rather than illuminate. The prosecution, similarly, must argue with full conviction for guilt, even in cases where evidence might suggest reasonable doubt. Both sides are performing a role, following rules that seem designed to obscure truth rather than discover it, yet we call this system the pursuit of justice. The paradox deepens when we recognize that this adversarial framework actually produced an assumption that truth will somehow emerge from the collision of these deliberately distorted narratives, as if honesty could be born from institutionalized dishonesty. We have essentially built a cathedral to truth using the building blocks of strategic falsehood, where witnesses swear oaths to tell the truth while sitting across from lawyers trained in the art of making truth irrelevant through clever questioning and procedural manipulation. Somehow we have convinced ourselves that this Byzantine structure, with its exclusion of evidence, its reliance on theatrical persuasion, and its celebration of rhetorical victory over factual accuracy, represents our best attempt at discovering what actually happened. Imagine you are presented with two identical envelopes, and you are told that one contains twice as much money as the other, though you do not know which is which. You select one envelope at random and open it to find, say, $100 inside. Now you face a decision. Should you stick with your envelope or should you switch to the other one? The logical reasoning that follows creates a peculiar trap for the mind. If your envelope contains $100, then the other envelope must contain either $50 or $200 with equal probability, meaning it has a 50% chance of containing half your amount and a 50% chance of containing double. When you calculate the expected value of switching, you find that the other envelope is worth an average of $125, which is more than the 100 you currently hold. This suggests you should always switch, but here lies the paradox. This logic applies regardless of which envelope you initially chose or how much money you discover inside. If you had opened the other envelope first, the same calculation would suggest switching back to the one you rejected. The reasoning appears to prove that you should perpetually exchange envelopes in an endless cycle, never settling on one, which is obviously absurd. The problem persists because it exploits a subtle flaw in probability reasoning, specifically in how we assign probabilities to unknown quantities when working backwards from observed evidence. Our minds struggle to recognize that the initial equal probability assumption breaks down once you have actual information, yet the mathematical notation makes the faulty logic appear sound and authoritative. We continue to find this paradox genuinely unsettling because it reveals how easily our intuitions about chance and value can deceive us. Imagine a woman named Beauty is put into a deep sleep on Sunday evening, and before she drifts away, she is told that a fair coin will be flipped to determine what happens next. If the coin lands on heads, she will be awakened on Monday, interviewed about her beliefs, and then put back to sleep with a memory-erasing drug so she will not remember the Monday awakening. If the coin lands on tails, she will be awakened on both Monday and Tuesday, interviewed both times, and then awakened again on Wednesday to learn the results. The critical detail is that Beauty will not know which day she has awakened on, nor will she know whether the coin showed heads or tails. When Beauty awakes in this darkness, uncertain and confused, a researcher asks her a deceptively simple question: what is the probability that the coin landed on heads? This seemingly straightforward probability question has fractured the philosophical community into two irreconcilable camps for decades, each armed with compelling mathematical arguments and logical reasoning. One perspective contends that the probability remains 1/2 because the coin flip itself was fair and nothing about her awakening changes that fundamental fact. The other perspective argues that the probability should be 1/3 because Beauty will experience awakenings twice as often when tails occurs compared to when heads occurs, making tails twice as likely from her subjective position. The paradox emerges from the collision between objective probability, which seems immutable and independent of observation, and subjective probability, which depends entirely on what an observer knows and experiences. This creates a profound tension because both mathematical frameworks appear internally consistent and logically sound, yet they yield different answers to the same question. Imagine yourself standing before 3 closed doors in a television studio, facing a game show host named Monty Hall who presents you with a simple proposition. Behind one door stands a valuable prize, perhaps a new car, while behind the other 2 doors wait only goats, animals of considerably less monetary value. You are asked to choose one door, and you select it with the reasonable assumption that you have a 1 in 3 chance of winning the prize. The host, who knows exactly what lies behind each door, then opens one of the remaining doors that he knows contains a goat, revealing the animal inside to you. Now 2 doors remain closed, the one you originally selected and one other, and the host offers you a choice, asking whether you would like to stay with your original selection or switch to the remaining unopened door. This moment of decision creates one of the most persistently counterintuitive problems in probability theory, one that has confused mathematicians, statisticians, and casual observers for decades. The paradox emerges because most people's intuition insists that since 2 doors remain and only one contains the prize, the probability must be evenly split at 50% for each door. Yet the mathematical reality reveals something far more unsettling. Switching to the other door actually gives you a 2 in 3 chance of winning, while staying with your original choice maintains only a 1 in 3 chance. This violation of our intuitive sense of probability persists because we fail to account for the crucial fact that the host's action of revealing a goat was not random, but was instead informed by his knowledge of what lay behind each door. When you initially chose your door, you had a 1 in 3 chance of being correct, which means there was a 2 in 3 chance that the prize existed behind one of the other 2 doors. Imagine a casino in 18th century Russia where a peculiar game is offered to you, a game so mathematically generous that it seems almost impossible to turn down. Yet the moment you do the mathematics yourself, you begin to understand why rational people consistently refuse to play it, and this strange disconnect between what the numbers tell us we should want and what we actually want is the essence of the St. Petersburg Paradox. The game works like this. A coin is flipped repeatedly, and you are paid 2 rubles if it lands on heads the first flip, 4 rubles if it lands on tails the first time and heads the second time, 8 rubles if it takes 3 flips, 16 if it takes 4, and so on, doubling each time the sequence continues, which means mathematically speaking, the expected value of playing this game is infinite because you multiply each potential payout by its probability and sum them all together, yielding an endless result that suggests you should be willing to pay any amount of money, even your entire life savings, for a single opportunity to play. Yet almost nobody would actually wager more than a few rubles, revealing a profound gap between theoretical expectation and human intuition that has puzzled economists and philosophers for centuries. The mechanism driving this paradox lies in how our brains actually process risk and value, for while mathematicians can prove that the expected value is infinite, real human decision-making operates through diminishing marginal utility, meaning that an additional ruble matters far less to someone who already has 1,000 than to someone who has only 10. And our minds instinctively account for the astronomical improbability of reaching the later stages of the game where the truly massive payouts would occur, making the prospect feel practically worthless despite what pure mathematics suggests. Imagine yourself presented with two separate gambling scenarios, each requiring you to make a choice about which lottery ticket you would prefer to purchase. In the first scenario, you are offered a choice between receiving $99 million with absolute certainty, or alternatively, you could take a gamble where you have an 89% chance of winning $100 million, a 10% chance of winning nothing at all, and a 1% chance of winning $99 million. Most people in this situation will choose the certain $99 million, preferring the safety of guaranteed wealth over the uncertain possibility of winning more. Now consider a second scenario that appears mathematically unrelated to the first. Here you must choose between a 10% chance of winning $99 million with nothing otherwise, or a 10% chance of winning $100 million with nothing otherwise. In this scenario, most people switch their preference entirely, now choosing the 10% chance at $100 million despite having rejected a similar probability advantage moments before. This is the Allais Paradox, first identified by economist Maurice Allais in 1953, and it reveals a fundamental contradiction in how human beings evaluate risk and make decisions about money. The mechanism underlying this paradox involves what psychologists call the certainty effect, a cognitive bias where people disproportionately weight outcomes that are guaranteed compared to outcomes that are merely probable. When we face a choice with certainty, our brains treat it as categorically different from uncertainty, valuing the psychological comfort of guaranteed outcomes far more heavily than pure mathematical calculation would justify. Imagine you are presented with an urn containing 100 balls, and you are told with absolute certainty that some are red and some are black, though you do not know the exact distribution between them. You are offered a choice. You may either bet on drawing a red ball from this urn of unknown composition, or you may bet on drawing a red ball from a second urn that you know with complete certainty contains exactly 50 red balls and 50 black balls. Most people, when faced with this scenario, prefer to bet on the urn with known probabilities, even though the expected value should theoretically be identical in both cases. This preference reveals something deeply troubling about human decision-making under uncertainty, something that economist Daniel Ellsberg discovered creates a paradox that violates the fundamental principles of rational choice theory. When you are given a choice between known and unknown probabilities, you systematically avoid the unknown, exhibiting what we call ambiguity aversion, and this tendency persists even when the unknown option might objectively offer equal or superior returns. The paradox deepens when you consider that this same person will often reverse their preference when the scenario is framed differently, such as betting on black balls instead of red, or when considering losses rather than gains. The psychological mechanism driving this behavior appears to stem from our profound discomfort with unknowns, our deep evolutionary preference for information and certainty, and our tendency to interpret missing information as a potential threat rather than a neutral absence of data. We have constructed entire financial systems, insurance markets, and investment strategies around the assumption that people behave rationally according to mathematical probability. Yet the Ellsberg Paradox demonstrates that we fundamentally distrust probability itself when we cannot verify it with our own eyes or calculations. Imagine walking into a coffee shop where you are presented with 47 varieties of single-origin beans, each one meticulously sourced from different regions across the globe, each one promising a unique flavor profile and sensory experience that the others cannot deliver. And as you stand before this overwhelming array of possibilities, you feel not excitement but paralysis, a creeping sense of dread that whatever choice you make will inevitably be the wrong one. That somewhere in this collection exists the perfect coffee that would have transformed your morning, and you have just selected the suboptimal option. This is the paradox of choice, a phenomenon that reveals how an abundance of options, rather than increasing satisfaction and freedom, actually diminishes both, trapping us in cycles of decision fatigue, regret, and perpetual second-guessing. The mechanism operates through several psychological channels simultaneously. When choices are limited, we are content with good enough, but when options multiply exponentially, our expectations rise proportionally, making satisfaction harder to achieve because we become acutely aware of every alternative path not taken, every potential experience foregone, and we begin to blame ourselves for not choosing more optimally. Additionally, the cognitive burden of evaluating numerous alternatives exhausts our mental resources, leaving us depleted and less capable of enjoying whatever we ultimately select, our satisfaction poisoned by the knowledge that we made this decision while mentally fatigued. What makes this paradox so persistently dangerous is that modern consumer culture has built itself entirely upon the assumption that more choice equals more happiness. Yet decades of research demonstrate the opposite, and still we continue to expand our options in nearly every domain of life, from streaming services with millions of titles to dating applications presenting endless potential partners to. Imagine a family sitting together on a hot summer afternoon in a small Texas town, and someone suggests taking a drive to Abilene, a city 50 miles away, despite the heat being unbearable and the air conditioning in their car being questionable at best. Everyone agrees to go, though none of them actually want to make the trip, and they spend hours driving through the desert, arriving sweaty and exhausted, only to sit in a dusty restaurant before driving all the way back home. When they finally return, someone admits they never wanted to go in the first place, and to their shock, everyone else confesses the same thing. Each person had agreed to something they actively opposed because they believed the others wanted it, creating a collective decision that contradicted everyone's individual preferences. This is the Abilene Paradox, a phenomenon where groups take actions contrary to what any individual member actually desires, yet somehow reach consensus anyway. The psychological mechanism driving this paradox operates through a combination of fear, assumption, and social pressure that silently accumulates without anyone ever openly expressing dissent. People assume that disagreeing with the group consensus would mark them as selfish, difficult, or uncommitted to the team's well-being, so they suppress their true preferences and align themselves with what they perceive as the group's wishes. The problem deepens because this fear is shared by everyone simultaneously, meaning that the perceived group consensus is itself based on a collection of individual lies rather than any authentic collective desire. Nobody wants to speak up first because doing so requires believing that your perspective matters more than harmony, that your discomfort is worth potentially creating tension. Admiral James Stockdale was a decorated military officer who spent 7 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, enduring torture, solitary confinement, and psychological torment that would break most ordinary people. Yet unlike many of his fellow prisoners, Stockdale survived and eventually returned home to tell his story. When management theorist Jim Collins interviewed him years later to understand how he had managed to survive where others had not, Stockdale revealed something profound about human resilience that contradicted everything we might expect from logic. He explained that the prisoners who did not make it were often the optimists, the ones who convinced themselves they would be released by Christmas, then Thanksgiving, then Easter, only to have those hopes repeatedly shattered by the brutal reality of their circumstances. Each failed hope crushed them further until they lost the will to survive entirely. Stockdale himself, by contrast, had made a conscious decision to accept the worst possible outcome, that he might never leave that prison, that he might die there, that his suffering might be permanent and meaningless. This acceptance, paradoxically, freed him to maintain hope about the overall outcome while simultaneously confronting the harshest truths of his immediate situation. The paradox emerges from this strange duality. You must maintain unwavering faith that you will ultimately prevail while simultaneously confronting the most brutal facts of your current reality, no matter how discouraging they appear. Most people cannot hold both truths simultaneously in their minds. We tend toward either blind optimism or crushing pessimism, but never the two together. Yet somehow, in accepting the worst while believing in ultimate victory, humans discover a psychological flexibility that allows them to navigate impossible circumstances with greater clarity than those who refuse to acknowledge difficulty. The Icarus Paradox describes a phenomenon where the very competencies and strengths that propel an organization, individual, or system to extraordinary success ultimately become the seeds of its eventual decline and downfall. Consider the ambitious entrepreneur who builds a thriving company through bold risk-taking and innovative thinking. only to find that, as their company grows larger and more successful, the same boldness that created their fortune transforms into recklessness, and the innovation that once defined them calcifies into rigid adherence to outdated strategies that no longer serve their market. The organization becomes so committed to the methods that worked brilliantly in the past that they lose the flexibility necessary to adapt when circumstances change, flying higher and higher on wings of wax until the sun's heat becomes unbearable. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox stems from what researchers call competency blindness, wherein success breeds overconfidence and a false sense of invulnerability, causing leaders and organizations to attribute their achievements purely to their own exceptional abilities rather than recognizing the role of timing, luck, market conditions, and external factors. This distorted perception of causality leads to an escalating sense of certainty that borders on arrogance, where the successful entity becomes increasingly resistant to feedback, skeptical of warning signs, and dismissive of competitors or alternative approaches. The very metrics that once indicated healthy growth become distorted into measures of infallibility, creating an echo chamber where dissenting voices are marginalized and contrary evidence is rationalized away. What makes this paradox particularly insidious is how deeply normalized it has become in our cultural understanding of success, where we celebrate the confident leader and the company that doubles down on its winning formula, rarely pausing to acknowledge T. Consider the person who dedicates their entire existence to the pursuit of pleasure, believing that happiness is achieved through the relentless accumulation of enjoyable experiences and the avoidance of pain at all costs. This individual seeks out every opportunity for gratification, whether through indulgence in food, entertainment, substances, or sensory experiences, operating under the assumption that maximizing pleasure will inevitably maximize their overall happiness and life satisfaction. Yet as weeks and months pass, something peculiar begins to unfold within their consciousness, a strange inversion of their expectations that contradicts the very foundation of their hedonistic philosophy. The pleasures that once brought genuine joy become increasingly hollow and unsatisfying, each experience met with a diminishing sense of fulfillment, as though the nervous system itself has adapted to the constant stimulation and now demands ever greater intensities to produce the same emotional response. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a psychological process known as hedonic adaptation, wherein our brains naturally adjust baseline expectations upward following positive experiences, causing previously thrilling sensations to feel mundane and ordinary by comparison. What this reveals is that pleasure pursued as an end goal becomes self-defeating, because happiness appears to emerge not from the direct chase of enjoyable moments, but rather from meaningful engagement with purpose, relationships, growth, and even struggle itself. The paradox persists across modern society because our consumer culture systematically encourages this very pursuit, creating endless marketing narratives that promise fulfillment through acquisition and indulgence, despite mounting evidence that this approach produces anxiety, emptiness, and an exhausting treadmill of diminishing returns that characterizes the lives of those most devoted to hedonistic P. Imagine an entire nation gripped by economic uncertainty, where households and businesses alike decide that the prudent course of action is to reduce spending and increase their savings, cutting back on consumption in hopes of building financial security for themselves and their families. On the surface, this seems entirely rational, a logical response to fear and instability, yet as millions of people simultaneously make this identical choice, the collective outcome becomes something entirely different from what any individual would have predicted or desired. When everyone saves more and spends less, businesses lose customers and revenue, factories reduce production, workers face layoffs and wage cuts, and unemployment rises sharply throughout the economy. The reduction in spending causes overall economic demand to collapse, which paradoxically makes people poorer, not richer, because the economy contracts and asset values decline, making the very savings that people accumulated worth considerably less than they anticipated. The mechanism behind this paradox operates through what economists call a coordination failure, wherein each rational individual decision creates an irrational collective outcome that harms everyone, including those who were most disciplined in their thrift. When one person saves while others continue spending, that individual benefits from the healthy economy while building personal wealth. When everyone saves simultaneously, nobody benefits because the economic machine itself slows to a crawl, tax revenues plummet, government services deteriorate, and the entire system enters a deflationary spiral where money becomes scarcer and debts become harder to repay. This paradox persists despite its illogical nature, because we live in societies that celebrate thrift and frugality as inherent virtues, praising individuals for their discipline while ignoring the macroeconomic consequences of universal frugality, creating a cultural. Imagine a factory owner in the 1800s discovering that a new steam engine design burns coal far more efficiently than the old one, consuming less fuel to produce the same amount of power, and yet somehow the factory ends up burning more coal than ever before. This counterintuitive phenomenon, named after economist William Stanley Jevons, who first documented it in 1865, reveals a fundamental crack in our assumptions about resource conservation and technological progress. When efficiency improvements lower the effective cost of using a resource, demand for that resource actually increases, often by enough to completely offset or even exceed the original savings, creating a paradox where making something more efficient somehow leads to greater overall consumption. The mechanism driving this paradox operates through economic incentives rather than human irrationality, though the two often intertwine in complex ways. As efficiency reduces the per-unit cost of energy, transportation, or materials, it becomes economically viable to use that resource in new applications and contexts where it previously seemed too expensive, simultaneously making existing uses more affordable to expand. A car that gets better fuel economy suddenly makes long-distance commuting practical where it wasn't before. More efficient lighting enables us to illuminate spaces that once remained dark. Better agricultural yields from less water incentivize larger farms rather than water conservation. The paradox persists in our modern world despite our awareness of it, because efficiency improvements feel like unambiguous victories, tangible evidence of human ingenuity and progress, and we struggle psychologically to accept that solving one problem through technology might amplify another. Imagine a city planner in a bustling metropolitan area who receives a proposal to add a new road to the traffic network, a gleaming highway designed to alleviate congestion and provide drivers with an additional route option. The planner, confident in the logic of expansion, approves the project, expecting travel times across the network to improve. However, when the road opens and traffic begins to flow through this new corridor, something counterintuitive happens. The average commute time for everyone increases. The new road, rather than solving the problem, has made it worse for the collective population. This is Brice's paradox, named after mathematician Dietrich Brice, who discovered it in 1968, a paradox suggesting that adding capacity to a network can actually decrease overall performance. The mechanism underlying this strange phenomenon involves the selfish behavior of individual drivers who, when presented with a new option, each rationally choose the route that appears fastest for themselves at that moment. When one road becomes congested, drivers switch to what seems like a better alternative, but because everyone makes this same selfish calculation simultaneously, they all converge on the same paths, creating bottlenecks where none existed before. The new road becomes irresistibly attractive to drivers following their individual self-interest, drawing traffic away from previously optimal routes and funneling vehicles into a configuration that benefits no one. What makes this paradox so unsettling is that it reveals how our intuitive understanding of improvement fails us in interconnected systems where countless individuals make independent decisions. Despite decades of recognition by urban planners and traffic engineers, cities continue to experience versions of Brice's paradox regularly. Consider a pharmaceutical company testing two medications across two hospitals, and when you examine the data at each hospital separately, medication A performs better than medication B in both locations. Yet when you combine all the data together, medication B suddenly appears superior overall, a reversal so complete and counterintuitive that it seems to violate the basic laws of logic itself. This is Simpson's paradox, a statistical phenomenon where a trend that appears in separate groups completely reverses when those groups are combined, creating a situation where aggregate data tells an entirely different story than the component parts. The paradox emerges not from error or deception, but from the hidden influence of what statisticians call a confounding variable, a factor that shifts the composition of your groups in ways that distort the apparent relationship between your variables. In the medication example, perhaps one hospital treated far more critical patients with medication B, So medication B's overall success rate suffered despite actually being marginally better within that severely ill population. And when you pool everything together, this demographic difference inverts the conclusion entirely. The human mind struggles profoundly with this reversal because we intuitively believe that if something is true in all the parts, it must be true in the whole, a logical principle that feels almost sacred. Yet aggregation can fundamentally betray us when hidden variables are at play. We encounter Simpson's paradox constantly in real life without recognizing it. University admissions appear biased when you look at individual departments, yet unbiased overall because of differences in application rates between genders across departments, or athletic statistics seem to improve year over year, even as underlying performance declines due to changes in game frequency or player composition. Consider the peculiar mathematics of democratic participation, where millions of individuals cast ballots knowing with absolute certainty that their single vote will not determine the outcome of any election. Yet they continue to vote anyway, often with a sense of moral obligation and civic duty that feels entirely rational to them. This is the voting paradox, a phenomenon that has puzzled economists and behavioral scientists for decades, because by strict logical calculation, the probability that your individual vote will swing an election is so astronomically small that it should render the act of voting entirely irrational from a cost-benefit perspective. When you factor in the time spent researching candidates, traveling to polling locations, waiting in lines, and the opportunity cost of those hours spent doing something else, the rational actor model suggests that almost nobody should vote, yet roughly half of eligible voters in most democracies do exactly that. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates in the psychological space between individual cost-benefit analysis and collective identity, where people simultaneously know that their vote probably will not matter in isolation while also believing, perhaps unconsciously, that voting matters because everyone else votes too, creating a strange loop of conditional rationality. We justify our participation by focusing on the collective consequences rather than individual impact, telling ourselves that if everyone reasoned as we do and didn't vote, then democracy would collapse entirely, which is absolutely true. Yet this reasoning somehow coexists with the knowledge that whether we personally vote or not has virtually no bearing on whether democracy survives. Despite this fundamental contradiction between what logic dictates and what we actually do, voting persists as a deeply normalized civic ritual, something we pass down to new generations as a moral imperative rather than examining tea. Consider the voting process in democratic societies, where millions of citizens cast ballots to select their leaders, believing that their individual choices matter and will be accurately translated into collective representation. Kenneth Arrow, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, demonstrated mathematically in 1950 that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy 5 seemingly reasonable conditions. That it reflects individual preferences, that it never imposes outcomes regardless of what people want, that it never gives one person dictatorial power, that it respects the independence of irrelevant alternatives, and that if everyone prefers one option over another, the collective result must reflect this preference. The impossibility theorem reveals that any voting mechanism we choose must betray at least one of these principles, meaning our most cherished democratic institutions are fundamentally compromised at their mathematical core. Yet we continue voting, continue trusting electoral outcomes, continue believing in the legitimacy of our chosen leaders, fully aware on some level that the very architecture of selection contains an inescapable logical flaw that no refinement or innovation can completely resolve. We have collectively decided to ignore or suppress the knowledge that our systems of preference aggregation are theoretically impossible, that they necessarily privilege certain voices while silencing others, that they create winners and losers through mechanisms that violate basic fairness principles. This paradox persists not because we have solved it, but because accepting it would require dismantling the foundation of representative government itself. And so instead we maintain elaborate rituals of voting and counting and announcing results as though the impossibility does not exist, as though our democratic processes are genuinely democratic when mathematics itself insists they cannot be, a comfortable fiction we have. Imagine a group of 3 people voting on 3 different options, perhaps choosing between candidates for office or deciding which policy direction to pursue, and suppose that person A prefers option 1 over option 2, and option 2 over option 3, giving a clear ranking of 1, 2, 3. Person B, meanwhile, prefers option 2 over option 3, and option 3 over option 1, ranking them as 2, 3, 1 in order of preference. Person C completes the trio by preferring option 3 over option 1, and option 1 over option 2, ranking them as 3, 1, 2. When we examine these individual preferences, each person holds a perfectly rational and internally consistent ordering, yet something extraordinary happens when we attempt to aggregate these preferences into a collective decision through majority voting. If we pit option 1 against option 2, persons A and C prefer 1 to 2, so 1 wins by majority. If we then compare option 2 against option 3, persons B and C prefer 2 to 3, so 2 wins by majority. By the logical laws of transitivity, we should expect that option 1 defeats option 3, yet when we directly compare these two options, persons B and A prefer 3 to 1, giving 3 the majority victory. The group collectively prefers 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 1, creating a circular preference that violates fundamental principles of rational choice theory. This phenomenon, first identified by the French mathematician and philosopher Nicolas de Condorcet in 1785, reveals a profound truth about democratic aggregation. The preferences of rational individuals can combine through voting mechanisms to produce collective preferences that are themselves irrational and paradoxical. We encounter this paradox perpetually in real political systems whenever multi-candidate elections occur, in organizational decisions involving multiple stakeholders, and in any scenario where diverse. Imagine a committee of 3 rational people who must vote on a complex policy question, and imagine that each person individually holds coherent, reasonable beliefs about what should be done, yet when they vote collectively through a series of seemingly logical steps, they arrive at a conclusion that contradicts what each of them actually believes. This is the Discursive Dilemma, a paradox that reveals a profound fracture between individual rationality and collective decision-making. Consider a legislature voting on whether to fund a public works project based on 3 separate propositions. First, whether the project is economically sound. Second, whether the environmental impact is acceptable. And third, whether the project should proceed given the previous 2 assessments. A legislator might believe the project is economically sound and environmentally acceptable, yet still believe it should not proceed, perhaps due to political considerations or timing issues. Another legislator might hold a different configuration of beliefs, and a third another still. When each group votes on the 3 propositions separately through majority rule, it becomes entirely possible for the majority to vote yes on economic soundness, yes on environmental acceptability, and yet no on whether the project should proceed, creating a logical impossibility that no individual actually endorses. The mechanism underlying this paradox is the aggregation problem itself. There is no consistent way to combine individual preferences or judgments into a collective judgment without either abandoning some principle of democracy or accepting logical contradiction. It emerges from the assumption that we can treat collective decision-making as though it operates under the same rules of individual logic and consistency, when in fact groups can arrive at positions that would be considered irrational if held by a single person. Consider the peculiar experience of reading a novel or watching a film, wherein you find yourself genuinely moved to tears by the fate of a character you know with absolute certainty does not exist, has never existed, and will never exist outside the boundaries of the narrative constructed for your consumption. You experience authentic emotional responses, your heart rate elevates, your palms may grow clammy, you feel genuine concern for the well-being of someone comprised entirely of words or pixels arranged in a particular sequence. This is the fundamental paradox of fiction, a contradiction that sits at the very heart of human aesthetic experience. We invest emotional energy, sometimes profound emotional energy, into entities we consciously acknowledge are fictional constructs. We weep for people who never lived, we fear threats that pose no actual danger, we celebrate victories that occurred nowhere in the real world. The logical mechanism at work here operates through what psychologists call suspension of disbelief, a voluntary cognitive process wherein we temporarily compartmentalize our rational knowledge of a work's unreality in order to engage with it on an emotional level. Our minds possess a remarkable capacity to treat these fictional entities as if they possessed genuine moral weight and significance, to grant them a kind of provisional reality within the space of our imagination. Yet the paradox deepens when we recognize that this emotional response is entirely authentic even as its object is entirely artificial. The tears you cry are real, the reasons for them are not. We have somehow normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we rarely pause to examine it. We attend funerals for fictional characters in our minds, we argue passionately about their moral choices, we construct elaborate theories about their motivations and futures, and we do all this while maintaining perfect awareness that we are engaging in elaborate pretend. We voluntarily seek out experiences designed to frighten us, to disturb us, to trigger our most primal survival instincts, yet we do so from positions of complete safety, knowing with absolute certainty that no genuine threat exists, and this fundamental contradiction sits at the heart of why horror entertainment has become one of the most widely consumed forms of human expression. When we watch a horror film or read a terrifying novel, our bodies respond with genuine physiological reactions. Our hearts race, our pupils dilate, stress hormones flood our systems, and our fight-or-flight response activates as though we were facing actual mortal danger. Yet our rational minds maintain the simultaneous awareness that we are secure on our couches, in our beds, or in darkened theaters where the threats are mere illusions constructed from pixels and paper and performance. The paradox deepens when we recognize that the more effectively a horror narrative manipulates our fear responses, the more we seem to enjoy it, creating a strange economy of pleasure derived directly from psychological discomfort. Psychologically, this phenomenon emerges from our need to experience danger in controlled environments, to rehearse our responses to threat without consequence, to inoculate ourselves against terror through carefully calibrated exposure. Yet this explanation only partially accounts for the intensity with which we pursue these experiences. We have somehow normalized the idea that entertainment should make us afraid, that art should disturb us, that we should pay money or dedicate our time to experiences that trigger genuine distress, and this normalization is itself remarkable when examined closely. The paradox of horror persists because it serves purposes we do not fully understand, operating at the intersection of our desire for simulation, our fascination with the forbidden, our need to process darkness in manageable doses, and our strange human capacity. Consider the curious inversion that computer scientist Hans Moravec discovered in the 1980s when examining the relative difficulty of programming artificial intelligence systems. Tasks that require conscious deliberation and abstract reasoning in human beings, such as playing chess or solving complex mathematical equations, prove remarkably straightforward to implement in machines, whereas tasks that young children accomplish with effortless intuition, such as recognizing faces in a crowd, understanding spoken language in noisy environments, or navigating physical space without collision, present extraordinarily complex challenges to even our most advanced artificial systems. The paradox emerges from a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of human cognition that persists in our cultural imagination, the assumption that conscious thought represents the pinnacle of mental difficulty, while instinctive, embodied processes constitute something lesser and more primitive. In reality, the evolutionary timeline reveals an inverse relationship. Our conscious reasoning abilities developed relatively recently in biological terms, occupying perhaps the last few million years of human existence, whereas our sensory motor and perceptual systems evolved over hundreds of millions of years, accumulating unfathomable complexity in their neural architecture and behavioral sophistication. When we attempt to replicate these ancient systems in silicon, we confront the staggering intricacy of processes we take for granted precisely because they operate beneath conscious awareness. This paradox persists in contemporary discourse because we continue to valorize explicit reasoning and abstract problem-solving as markers of intelligence, while treating perception and physical embodiment as somehow separate from or subordinate to true cognition, a categorization that obscures rather than illuminates our understanding of both human and machine intelligence. Consider the fundamental tension that emerges whenever a researcher attempts to study human behavior in its natural state, for the very act of observation inevitably changes the phenomenon being observed, creating a paradox so deeply embedded in our methodologies that we have learned to simply accept it as an unavoidable cost of understanding ourselves. When a linguist records speakers to analyze natural speech patterns, those speakers become acutely aware of the microphone and begin to modify their language, pronouncing words more carefully, avoiding colloquialisms, and generally performing a version of themselves rather than existing authentically within their normal patterns of communication. The same principle applies to sociological observation, where individuals being studied unconsciously shift their behavior the moment they realize they are being watched, whether consciously or subconsciously, transforming the very data the researcher sought to capture into something fundamentally artificial and representative not of reality, but of reality filtered through self-awareness and the desire to present oneself favorably. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon our deep-seated social awareness and our evolved capacity to model how others perceive us, a feature that served our ancestors well in navigating complex social hierarchies, but now undermines our ability to objectively document ourselves and our societies. We cannot simply turn off this awareness, cannot genuinely unknow that we are being observed, and therefore cannot return to the unmeasured state that existed before the observation began, creating an impossible circularity where the pursuit of truth about natural behavior necessarily destroys the naturalness of that behavior. Imagine a factory in Chicago during the 1920s where researchers arrived to study worker productivity, and the moment their clipboards came out and their eyes began watching, something peculiar happened. The workers began working harder, producing more, moving with greater efficiency than they had in weeks prior, not because their conditions had genuinely improved or their compensation had increased, but simply because they knew they were being observed and studied. The researchers adjusted the lighting in the factory, expecting productivity to rise with brighter conditions, and it did, so they dimmed the lights to test the opposite hypothesis, and productivity rose again, defying all rational expectation and suggesting that the act of measurement itself, the mere presence of scrutiny and attention, had become the true variable influencing human behavior rather than any actual environmental change. This phenomenon became known as the Hawthorne Effect, named after the Western Electric Hawthorne Works facility where these studies took place, and it reveals something fundamentally unsettling about human nature, that we are not autonomous agents acting according to our genuine preferences and capabilities, but rather self-conscious performers constantly modulating our behavior based on perceived observation, unable to exist in a state of authentic, unmonitored action. The mechanism operates through a combination of social awareness and the human tendency toward self-improvement when we sense evaluation, as if an internal spotlight activates whenever external attention arrives, compelling us to present a version of ourselves that we believe aligns with expectations or demonstrates our value, and this instinctive performance can override our natural tendencies so completely that we may lose track of who we are when unwatched. Consider the student who enters an examination hall believing they will fail, their mind already resigned to poor performance before a single question has been read, and notice how this initial conviction shapes every subsequent action and thought throughout that critical morning. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple yet profoundly powerful. The belief itself becomes the architect of the very reality it predicts, not through any mystical force, but through the subtle and relentless influence of expectation on behavior, perception, and effort. When someone holds a conviction about their future, that conviction infiltrates their conscious choices and unconscious habits, altering how much energy they invest in preparation, how they interpret ambiguous feedback, which challenges they choose to face or avoid, and ultimately whether they persist when difficulty arises. The student who expects to fail studies less thoroughly because effort feels futile, interprets a moderately difficult problem as confirmation of their inadequacy rather than a solvable challenge, and abandons their attempt when frustration sets in, whereas a student with identical ability but opposite expectations would push through that same moment of difficulty and eventually succeed. What renders this paradox so psychologically dangerous is that the belief creates its own evidence, and once that cycle begins, distinguishing between the original limitation and the limitation created by the belief becomes nearly impossible. We observe this pattern repeating across employment scenarios where managers expect certain employees to be more capable and unconsciously give those employees more interesting assignments, more constructive feedback, and more opportunities for growth, causing those employees to genuinely become more capable over time. Consider the strange territory where a substance with no active pharmaceutical properties produces measurable, reproducible improvements in patient symptoms and outcomes, yet we call it inert and insist that nothing of medical value is actually occurring. A person suffering from chronic pain receives a pill they are told contains a powerful analgesic, but the pill contains only sugar or starch, and over time their pain genuinely diminishes, their brain chemistry shifts, their inflammation markers improve on blood tests, their quality of life measurably increases. The paradox emerges not from the existence of the placebo effect itself, which science has thoroughly documented and validated, but from our refusal to accept it as legitimate medicine while simultaneously relying upon it in clinical practice. We have created a system where physicians must prescribe genuine medications, but simultaneously acknowledge that a significant portion of their therapeutic benefit derives from expectation, ritual, and the healing narrative rather than chemical interaction. The mechanism operates through multiple pathways simultaneously. Anticipatory neurochemistry floods the brain with endogenous opioids and dopamine. The conscious expectation of healing triggers genuine physiological changes in the immune system. The social performance of medical care and the doctor's white coat and confident pronouncements convince the body's regulatory systems that recovery is appropriate and permissible. Yet despite understanding these mechanisms with increasing clarity through neuroscience and functional imaging, we persist in treating the placebo effect as somehow less real, less valuable, or less deserving of our trust than pharmaceutical mechanisms that operate through identical neural pathways and neurochemical cascades. Consider a patient who receives a prescription medication with a lengthy insert detailing potential side effects, ranging from mild nausea to severe complications, and within hours of taking that medication, the patient begins experiencing exactly those symptoms. Yet unknown to them, the pill they ingested contained no active ingredients whatsoever. This is the nocebo effect, the dark mirror of the placebo phenomenon, where negative expectations alone become sufficient to generate genuine physiological symptoms and suffering in the human body. The mechanism operates through the powerful intersection of belief, attention, and the nervous system's remarkable capacity to translate expectation into biological reality. When we anticipate harm, our body interprets this mental prediction as genuine threat, triggering the release of stress hormones, altering pain perception through descending inhibitory pathways, and creating inflammation responses that produce the very symptoms we feared. The brain essentially becomes convinced that danger is present and responds accordingly, generating real physical sensations that cannot be dismissed as purely imaginary because they exist as measurable neurological and physiological events. What makes the nocebo effect particularly paradoxical is that it persists even when we understand intellectually how it works, even when we know the pill contains nothing harmful, even when we are explicitly told that what we are experiencing should be impossible. Patients continue to report side effects after being informed they received placebos. Medical students develop symptoms they have just finished studying in their textbooks. People who read detailed accounts of potential adverse reactions experience those exact reactions at statistically higher rates than those who received no such information. Consider the moment when you ask a question with genuine curiosity, seeking knowledge about something you do not yet understand, and in that very act of asking, you have already begun to define the boundaries of what you are searching for, which means you have already partially answered your own question before receiving any response. This is the paradox of inquiry, a fundamental tension in how human knowledge develops and how we interact with the unknown. When a student raises their hand in class and asks their teacher what photosynthesis is, they have already committed to a particular framing of the question that excludes other ways of understanding plants and energy conversion. They have already assumed photosynthesis exists as a discrete phenomenon worth naming, and they have already limited the scope of possible answers by the very words they chose to use. The question itself becomes a boundary marker, a fence around the territory of inquiry, and in seeking knowledge, we simultaneously constrain the knowledge we can possibly find. The deeper mechanism at work here involves our cognitive relationship with language and categorization. To ask any question, we must use words, and words carry assumptions, histories, and limitations that shape what answers we can recognize as valid or meaningful. If you ask why people behave selfishly, you have already presupposed that selfishness exists as a coherent category, and that behavior can be cleanly sorted into selfish and non-selfish varieties, which itself excludes the possibility that your question is fundamentally misconceived. This paradox becomes even more troubling when we consider that the more specific and intelligent a question becomes, the more it presupposes, and therefore the more it risks being perfectly formed around an assumption that turns out to be false. Consider the peculiar predicament that emerges whenever you attempt to learn something entirely new, a paradox articulated by Plato through his character Meno in ancient dialogues that remains startlingly relevant to the human condition today. The paradox poses a deceptively simple question. How can you possibly seek to learn or discover something when you do not already know what it is that you are looking for? And conversely, if you already know what you're seeking, then there is no genuine need to search at all, rendering all inquiry fundamentally impossible and all knowledge acquisition logically absurd. This creates an intellectual trap that seems to eliminate the very possibility of learning itself, yet we navigate this apparent impossibility constantly throughout our lives without pause or recognition. When a student sits before a mathematics problem they have never encountered, they cannot search for its solution because they do not know what the solution looks like or even if one exists. And yet somehow through effort and exploration they arrive at understanding anyway, suggesting that something in our cognitive architecture operates beneath the threshold of conscious logical contradiction. The mechanism behind this persistence involves what might be called partial recognition, a state where we possess enough fragmentary knowledge to sense that gaps exist, enough awareness to perceive the shape of our own ignorance without needing complete knowledge of what we lack. We function through intuition and incremental recognition, gradually narrowing the space of possibility until the unknown becomes known, all while somehow bypassing the logical impasse that Meno identified. Our minds seem equipped with an ability to recognize rightness when we encounter it, to sense when a solution fits, even before we fully comprehend why it works, allowing us to bootstrap ourselves into understanding through a process that eludes formal logical justificati. Consider the strange logical territory inhabited by Fitch's paradox, a theorem that emerges from the deceptively simple idea that if something is true, then it is knowable. In 1963, the logician Frederick Fitch demonstrated that this innocent assumption leads to a profoundly disturbing conclusion. If there exists any true statement that nobody has ever known, then there must exist a true statement that is fundamentally unknowable, which immediately contradicts our original premise. Imagine a fact about the ancient world, something objectively true that occurred billions of years before human consciousness emerged, a geological event or chemical reaction that transpired in complete isolation from any mind. If we accept that all true statements are knowable in principle, then we are forced to conclude that either every single truth throughout history was somehow known by someone somewhere, at some point in time, or that certain truths are genuinely beyond the reach of knowledge itself. The paradox tightens its grip when we realize that asserting the existence of an unknowable truth becomes itself a knowable statement, creating a logical spiral that seems to devour its own premises. What makes this paradox so psychologically unsettling is that it forces us to confront the relationship between reality and human comprehension, challenging our fundamental intuition that truth exists independent of our awareness, while simultaneously suggesting that truth and knowability might be mysteriously intertwined. We have become comfortable with the notion that vast tracts of reality remain forever hidden from us, that the universe contains secrets that will never be excavated. Yet Fitch's paradox suggests that this comfort may itself be logically incoherent, that we cannot simultaneously hold the beliefs we have normalized without acknowledging a contradiction at the heart of how we understand knowledge and existence itself. Imagine standing in a room and uttering these words, "It is raining outside, but I do not believe it is raining outside." From a purely logical standpoint, there is nothing inherently contradictory about this statement. Rain could be falling while you personally maintain skepticism about its occurrence, perhaps due to faulty sensory information or deliberate doubt. Yet the moment you speak these words aloud, something profoundly strange occurs within the listener's mind. They experience an almost visceral sense that something has gone wrong, that you have asserted something impossible, even though your statement violates no formal law of logic. This is Moore's paradox, named after the 20th century philosopher George Edward Moore, who first noticed this peculiar disconnect between what we can logically say and what we can rationally assert. The paradox emerges from the fundamental gap between the content of our beliefs and the act of expressing them through language. When you assert a proposition, you implicitly announce that you believe it to be true. This is an unspoken social contract embedded within human communication itself. So when you simultaneously claim that it is raining while denying your belief in that very claim, you have created a kind of conversational impossibility. The listener recognizes that no reasonable person would assert something they did not believe, yet the logical structure of your sentence contains no formal contradiction. This tension persists even though philosophers and logicians have spent decades examining it, trying to resolve whether the problem lies in semantics, pragmatics, or some deeper feature of how belief and assertion intertwine. The paradox refuses to be eliminated entirely. Perhaps this is precisely what makes Moore's paradox so philosophically fertile. It reveals that rationality operates on two distinct levels simultaneously, where logical consistency and communicative coherence need not always. Consider the peculiar moment when you purchase a lottery ticket, knowing with absolute certainty that your chances of winning are vanishingly small, perhaps one in several million, and yet you find yourself genuinely hoping, even believing in some quiet corner of your mind, that this particular ticket might be the chosen one. This is the lottery paradox in its most fundamental form, a collision between what we know to be statistically true and what we allow ourselves to feel and believe in the moment of purchase. The paradox emerges from a simple logical problem. If the probability of any single ticket winning is so negligibly small that it is rational to believe you will not win, then it should also be rational to believe that no ticket will win, since each ticket shares that same infinitesimal probability. And yet millions of people participate in lotteries annually, suggesting that we do not actually hold these rational beliefs despite knowing the mathematics perfectly well. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox reveals how our minds compartmentalize knowledge and desire, keeping statistical understanding and emotional hope in separate chambers of consciousness. We maintain a kind of cognitive dissonance where we simultaneously hold two contradictory beliefs without experiencing the discomfort that logically should accompany such contradiction. The lottery paradox persists because human psychology is fundamentally structured around possibility rather than probability, around the idea that if something is theoretically possible, it becomes worthy of emotional investment and hope. We have normalized this paradox so completely that entire economies depend upon it, that governments run lotteries and market them knowing full well that the mathematical expectation for players is devastatingly negative. Consider the peculiar moment when you sit down to read a book and find yourself immediately drawn to the preface, the introduction, or the author's note that precedes the actual text, even though you already purchased the book with full intention of reading the main content itself. The preface exists as a preliminary explanation of what you are about to experience, yet in reading it first, you are essentially consuming a summary or interpretation of the very thing you came to discover on your own terms, which creates a strange loop where the introduction undermines the fresh encounter you sought. This phenomenon becomes even more pronounced in academic contexts, where students will read the introduction to a historical event or scientific concept before studying the primary sources or experimental data, thus allowing someone else's framework to shape their initial understanding before they can form their own observations. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep need for permission and context before engaging with unfamiliar material, a cognitive bias that makes us feel safer approaching new information when we have been guided toward it by an authority figure or experienced narrator. We have normalized this peculiar sequence despite the logical contradiction it contains, because the preface offers us the comfort of preparation and the reassurance that we are approaching the material correctly, even though this reassurance directly prevents us from experiencing the material as the author originally intended it to unfold. The paradox deepens when we consider that many prefaces themselves contain spoilers, revelations, or critical interpretations that would be better discovered during the reading experience itself. Yet we continue to read them first out of sheer habit and cultural expectation. Consider the simple logical statement that all ravens are black, a proposition that seems straightforward enough when you think about ornithology and the natural world around us. Yet this statement can be confirmed in two entirely different ways that reveal a profound crack in how we understand evidence itself. The traditional method would be to observe ravens directly, examining each one you encounter and noting their coloration, building up evidence through direct observation until you feel confident in the universal claim. However, there exists an alternative path to confirming this very same statement that feels absurd the moment you recognize it, yet remains logically valid according to classical deductive reasoning. You could instead examine objects that are not black, verify that they are indeed not black, and in doing so, you would technically be gathering evidence that confirms all ravens are black, because anything that is not black cannot be a raven, and therefore observing a red apple or a white cloud or a yellow pencil all serve as confirmation of the raven hypothesis. This peculiar equivalence troubles our intuition deeply because we understand at a visceral level that looking at apples tells us nothing whatsoever about ravens, that the color of fruit has no bearing on the plumage of birds, and yet the mathematical logic appears unassailable, leaving us suspended between what our reasoning tells us must be true and what our experience insists cannot possibly be relevant. The mechanism underlying this paradox stems from the nature of logical equivalence itself, where the statement all ravens are black is logically identical to all non-black things are non-ravens, meaning these two propositions are mirror images of each other in terms of their truth conditions, yet they feel categorically different to our minds because one directs our attention toward evidence we find meaningful and the other toward evidence we find meaningless. Imagine standing in a perfectly ordinary room during daylight hours, surrounded by familiar furniture and objects bathed in natural sunlight, and you experience no fear whatsoever, yet the moment the sun sets and darkness falls across that identical space, an unmistakable sense of dread begins to creep through your consciousness, making you feel profoundly unsafe in an environment that has not changed in any material way. This phenomenon, which Nelson Goodman articulated as a logical puzzle about the nature of properties and how we learn them, reveals something deeply unsettling about human perception and the architecture of fear itself. The paradox emerges from the observation that darkness is merely the absence of light, a purely negative condition, yet we assign to it intrinsic qualities of danger, threat, and wrongness that light does not possess in any reciprocal manner. When you enter a darkened space, you encounter nothing new, no novel entities have appeared, no structural elements of the room have been altered, and yet your mind instantaneously recalibrates its threat assessment based solely on this absence of electromagnetic radiation within a certain wavelength range. Goodman's deeper insight concerns how we learn and apply predicates to the world around us, demonstrating that the qualities we believe to be objective properties of darkness itself are actually projections of evolved survival instincts and cultural conditioning layered atop simple sensory deprivation. The paradox persists because we have forgotten, if we ever truly knew, that darkness carries no inherent danger except insofar as our ancestors survived predation and accidents better when they could see. Yet we continue to treat it as though it possesses genuine malevolent properties rather than recognizing it as a neutral canvas onto which we paint our fears. Consider the moment when you attempt to define a number by describing it in English, and in that very act of definition, you create a logical impossibility that seems to undermine the foundations of language itself. The Berry paradox emerges from a deceptively simple question: what is the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 English words? At first, this seems like a perfectly reasonable inquiry, the kind of mathematical puzzle that might appear in a logic textbook or a recreational mathematics collection. You might begin listing integers and their descriptions, noting how most numbers can be expressed quite economically in language, until you inevitably reach a point where the numbers become so large that describing them requires increasingly lengthy phrases and complex terminology. Yet here lies the trap that gives this paradox its power and its danger to orderly thought. If such a smallest number exists, then you have just described it in fewer than 20 words by calling it exactly that, the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 English words. This description itself contains only 19 words, which means the number you have just identified violates the very definition that was supposed to characterize it. The paradox reveals a fundamental instability in how language attempts to describe mathematical reality, exposing a slippage between the self-referential nature of linguistic description and the absolute precision that mathematics demands. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that it seems to suggest language contains hidden contradictions at its core, that our ability to communicate and define breaks down when we apply it reflexively to itself. We have learned to accept this paradox as a curiosity of linguistic semantics rather than confronting the deeper implications it presents about the relationship between language and truth, allowing it to persist in. Consider the peculiar situation where we attempt to define a real number, using only a finite sequence of English words, a concept that mathematician Jules Richard explored in the early 20th century. And in doing so, he unveiled a logical trap that still unsettles mathematicians and philosophers today. Imagine that we list all possible definitions of real numbers that can be expressed in the English language using fewer than 100 words, and we number these definitions in a systematic way according to some ordering principle, perhaps alphabetical or by length. Now we construct a new number by a diagonal process, taking the first digit after the decimal point of the first number and increasing it by 1, then taking the second digit of the second number and increasing it by 1, continuing this process infinitely. This newly constructed number, by definition, differs from every number in our original list by at least 1 digit in its decimal expansion, which means it cannot possibly be one of the numbers we defined with our finite English sentences. Yet we have just defined this number in English using only a finite number of words, specifically fewer than 100 words through this very explanation, creating a logical contradiction where something both must and cannot be in our enumerated list simultaneously. The mechanism beneath this paradox operates on the slippery boundary between language and mathematics, between the finite and the infinite, exploiting the fact that while there exist infinitely many real numbers, there exist only finitely many distinct English words, and therefore only finitely many possible definitions of any bounded length. Our minds resist this paradox because we assume that language operates on the same logical principles as pure mathematics, that if we can name something, define it, describe it with words, then it must be susceptible to our usual methods of classification and enumeration. Consider the innocent act of describing a word by using an adjective, a fundamental operation we perform constantly in language without ever questioning its underlying assumptions or potential contradictions. The Grelling-Nelson Paradox emerges from this simple premise by asking whether certain words can meaningfully describe themselves, and in doing so, it creates a logical trap that mirrors the strange self-referential loops found in mathematics and philosophy. Imagine that we classify adjectives into two categories: autological words which describe themselves and heterological words which do not describe themselves. The word short is autological because it is indeed short in length, while the word long is heterological because the word itself is not long at all. Now consider the word heterological itself, which means not self-describing, and ask whether it is heterological or autological. If heterological is heterological, then it describes itself as not self-describing, which makes it autological by definition. Yet if heterological is autological, then it must describe itself, making it heterological. This creates an infinite logical loop where neither category can contain the word without generating a contradiction, much like a mirror reflecting another mirror into infinity. The mechanism driving this paradox operates at the intersection of language and logic, where words attempt to reference their own properties while simultaneously existing as the very objects being described. We experience this psychological vertigo because our minds are accustomed to clear separation between the observer and the observed, between language and the reality it describes, and when that boundary dissolves, we confront a fundamental instability in how we construct meaning itself. Imagine a sentence that makes a claim about itself in such a way that accepting the claim as true forces you to accept anything you want as true, and rejecting it seems equally problematic. This is Curry's paradox, named after logician Haskell Curry, and it represents one of the most elegant and disturbing threats to our entire system of logic and meaning. Consider the sentence: if this sentence is true, then Santa Claus exists. The paradox emerges through a deceptively simple logical progression. If we assume the sentence is true, then by its own statement, if the sentence is true, then Santa Claus must exist, which means Santa Claus exists. If we assume the sentence is false, we face a peculiar problem because the sentence doesn't assert its own truth as a requirement for something true in the world. Instead, it creates a conditional loop that swallows any conclusion we might want. The mechanism works by exploiting self-reference combined with the conditional structure, creating what appears to be a valid logical inference that leads to absurdity. Unlike the classic liar's paradox, which simply declares this statement is false, Curry's paradox doesn't create an obvious contradiction. Instead, it demonstrates that self-referential conditionals can bootstrap arbitrary truths into existence through seemingly valid logical steps. What makes this particularly disturbing is that our everyday reasoning constantly relies on conditionals and self-reference without collapsing into chaos. Yet the paradox reveals an underlying fragility in how we connect these concepts together. We continue operating as though language and logic function reliably despite knowing that sentences can be constructed that exploit the very mechanisms we depend upon, creating a subtle vertigo in how we understand the foundation of meaning itself. Consider a peculiar situation where we have an infinite sequence of statements, each one making a claim about all the statements that come after it in the sequence. The first statement says that all of the statements numbered 2 and beyond are false. The second statement claims that all statements numbered 3 and onward are false. The third statement asserts that all statements from 4 forward are false, and this pattern continues infinitely without end. Now, to understand what makes this construction so deeply troubling, we must examine what happens when we attempt to evaluate the truth value of any single statement in this endless chain. If we assume the first statement is true, then all subsequent statements must be false, which means the second statement is false, which means at least one statement from 3 onward must be true, which contradicts our initial assumption. Yet if we assume the first statement is false, then at least one statement from 2 onward must be true, but we cannot identify which one without running into the same problem recursively down the infinite line. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep expectation that logical systems should be decidable, that we should be able to determine truth values through careful reasoning. Yet Allais Paradox presents us with a structure that seems perfectly coherent on its surface, while remaining fundamentally indeterminate in nature. What makes this paradox particularly insidious is that unlike the famous Allais Paradox, which directly refers to itself and creates an obvious circularity, Allais' construction avoids direct self-reference entirely, using only forward-looking claims across an infinite regress, and yet it achieves the same kind of logical impossibility. Imagine holding a solid sphere in your hands, feeling its weight and density, its continuity as a unified three-dimensional object. Now imagine that through a series of careful geometric divisions, you could separate this sphere into a finite number of distinct pieces, and through rotation and repositioning alone, without stretching or deforming the material, reassemble those exact same pieces into 2 complete spheres, each identical in size and composition to the original. This is the Banach-Tarski Paradox, a mathematical theorem proven in 1924 that suggests the impossible is, in fact, theoretically possible within the abstract realm of pure geometry and set theory. The mechanism behind this bewildering phenomenon rests upon properties of infinite sets and the nature of dimensionality in mathematical space. In three-dimensional Euclidean space, you can divide a sphere into infinitely many infinitesimally small pieces that lack conventional volume, yet when recombined through rigid motions, these volumeless components mysteriously reconstruct into tangible, measurable objects with genuine spatial extent. The paradox reveals that our intuitive understanding of volume, continuity, and mass conservation breaks down at the boundaries of infinite mathematics, where pieces that contain no measurable quantity can somehow combine to create something with absolute measure. What persists most strangely about this paradox is how we have intellectually accepted its validity while simultaneously recognizing its complete impossibility in any physical universe. Mathematicians acknowledge the theorem's airtight logical structure, while physicists dismiss any real-world application. Yet the paradox continues to haunt our assumptions about space, matter, and the foundations of reality itself, reminding us that the mathematical cosmos and the physical cosmos operate under fundamentally different rules. Consider a mathematical object of such peculiar construction that it possesses finite volume yet infinite surface area, a shape so geometrically impossible in its properties that it seems to violate the very foundations of spatial reasoning. This is Gabriel's horn, named after the archangel Gabriel who, according to Christian tradition, will blow his horn to announce the final judgment, a shape that exists perfectly well in the realm of pure mathematics, yet somehow seems to defy the laws of physics and intuition that govern our physical world. The horn is constructed by rotating the curve described by the function 1 divided by x around the horizontal axis, beginning at x equals 1 and extending infinitely outward, creating a shape that narrows infinitely yet never quite closes, a trumpet that extends forever into mathematical space while somehow taking up less room than a single unit cube. The paradox emerges from a genuinely strange property. You could theoretically fill this horn with paint, requiring only a finite amount of material, yet you could never paint its surface, as that surface extends infinitely and would require an infinite quantity of paint despite the interior volume being finite. This creates a logical impossibility in the physical world that somehow remains mathematically valid, a shape that seems to mock our understanding of how three-dimensional objects should behave. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on the rate of decrease in the horn's radius as it extends outward. The radius shrinks so rapidly that the volume it encloses converges to a finite number, while the surface area spreads so infinitely that it refuses to converge, a mathematical divergence that has no sensible physical analog. We have normalized this impossibility by accepting it as merely a curiosity of infinite mathematics, an abstract theoretical construct that need not conform to reality, yet it persists in unsettling our sense that mathematics sh. Imagine a hotel with infinitely many rooms, each one numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on, extending forever without end, a structure that exists only in the realm of pure mathematics, yet reveals something profoundly unsettling about the nature of infinity itself. The hotel is completely full, every single room occupied by a guest, yet when a new visitor arrives at the front desk requesting a room for the night, the manager does not turn them away or express concern, but instead asks every current guest to move to the next room over. So the person in room 1 moves to room 2, the person in room 2 moves to room 3, and this cascading shift continues infinitely down the line, leaving room 1 vacant for the newcomer. A solution that works perfectly despite the apparent impossibility. Now imagine that infinitely many new buses arrive, each carrying infinitely many passengers who all need rooms, and the manager simply rearranges all existing guests using a mathematical pairing system, assigning them to new rooms through what is called a diagonal enumeration, ensuring that every single new arrival finds accommodation in what should be an already saturated space. A feat that reveals how infinity plus infinity still equals infinity in a way that defies our intuitive understanding of addition and fullness. What makes this paradox so psychologically disorienting is that we are accustomed to thinking about hotels, buildings, and containers in terms of finite space, where fullness means no room remains. Yet infinity operates by entirely different rules, where adding more to an already infinite collection produces no contradiction whatsoever, a truth our minds struggle to internalize because we evolved reasoning about finite quantities and limited resources. We have come to accept this mathematical reality as simply part of how the universe works at its deepest levels, not questioning the strangeness that infinity permits impossibilities that finite log. Imagine standing at the edge of a coastline, looking down at the intricate patterns where land meets water, and consider this simple question: how long is this coast? The answer, it seems, should be straightforward, measurable, and definite, yet the moment you attempt to measure it with increasing precision, the coastline grows longer and longer without ever reaching a final true length. When you measure the British coastline with a ruler at a scale of 100 kilometers, you obtain one measurement, but when you switch to a finer ruler measuring at 10 kilometers, suddenly the coastline becomes significantly longer because you can now trace into smaller bays and peninsulas that were invisible at the cruder scale. Continue this process, zooming into finer and finer details, measuring with increasingly precise instruments that can detect every rock and pebble, and the coastline stretches toward infinity, approaching a mathematical concept known as fractal dimensionality. The paradox emerges from the fundamental nature of how coastlines form through chaotic natural processes that create self-similar patterns at every level of magnification, meaning that no matter how closely you examine them, they always contain new irregularities to measure. This phenomenon reveals something deeply unsettling about the very concept of measurement itself, and our assumption that physical objects possess inherent, objective dimensions independent of the perspective from which we observe them. We have normalized this paradox by simply accepting that coastline length depends entirely on the scale of measurement, yet we still draw precise political boundaries along these infinite, unmeasurable lines, creating international law based on something fundamentally indeterminate. Imagine standing outside on a clear night, gazing upward at the vast darkness of the cosmos, and consider a deceptively simple question. If the universe is infinite and filled with an infinite number of stars, why is the night sky not blazing with light? This is Olbers Paradox, named after the 19th century astronomer Heinrich Olbers, though the question troubled philosophers and scientists for centuries before him. The paradox presents us with an elegantly troubling logical knot that challenges our fundamental understanding of existence itself. If we accept that the universe is infinite in size and contains an infinite number of stars distributed throughout space, then the night sky should be entirely illuminated, as bright as the surface of the sun itself, because every line of sight from Earth would eventually terminate upon a star somewhere in the infinite expanse. Yet our empirical observation contradicts this reasoning absolutely. The night sky remains predominantly dark, a vast canvas of blackness punctuated by isolated points of light. The psychological weight of this paradox lies in the collision between mathematical logic and observed reality, between what our rational mind insists must be true and what our eyes plainly show us. We find ourselves trapped between two apparently ironclad positions. Either the universe is not truly infinite as we believed, or there exists some fundamental mechanism preventing this infinite light from reaching us. For centuries, this paradox persisted as a genuine philosophical crisis, and remarkably, it was never adequately resolved until the 20th century when modern cosmology provided answers through concepts previously unavailable to earlier thinkers. The Big Bang Theory, the finite age of the universe, cosmic expansion, and the absorption of light by interstellar dust all conspire to explain why infinite stars need not produce infinite brightness. Imagine two identical containers, each filled with the same gas at the same temperature and pressure, separated by a thin partition. A chemist removes this partition, allowing the gases to mix freely, and observes that entropy increases as thermodynamics predicts it must. Yet here lies the peculiar problem. If the two gases are truly identical in every molecular way, if they possess the same properties and behave in identical fashion, then how can their mixture represent an increase in disorder or randomness when nothing has fundamentally changed about the system itself? This is Gibbs Paradox, named after physicist Josiah Willard Gibbs, and it reveals a troubling gap between our mathematical understanding of entropy and the physical reality we observe. The mathematics tells us that when two gases mix, entropy increases by a specific calculable amount, yet the identical nature of the gases suggests that no real mixing has occurred at all, only a rearrangement of indistinguishable particles. The resolution lies in the recognition that particles are fundamentally indistinguishable at the quantum level, that identical gas molecules cannot truly be tracked or distinguished from one another in any meaningful physical sense, and therefore the very concept of mixing becomes philosophically murky when applied to identical systems. Yet we persist in teaching entropy and mixing as straightforward classical phenomena, applying formulas developed in the 19th century to situations that quantum mechanics has since complicated immensely, creating a persistent cognitive dissonance between what the equations demand and what our intuition about identity and change suggests should be true. The paradox endures not because we lack the mathematical tools to address it, but because we have normalized the language of classical thermodynamics so thoroughly into our scientific discourse that we rarely pause to examine whether our fundamental categories of sameness and. Imagine a circle drawn on a piece of paper, and imagine that you must select a random chord, which is simply a straight line connecting any 2 points on the circumference of that circle. Now, the question becomes deceptively simple. What is the probability that this randomly chosen chord will be longer than the side of an equilateral triangle inscribed within that same circle? The paradox emerges not from the question itself, but from the disturbing realization that the answer depends entirely on how you decide to choose the chord randomly. And different methods of random selection produce wildly different probabilities, ranging from 1/2 to 1/3 to 1/4, with no objective reason to prefer any answer over the others. This means that the concept of randomness itself, something we assume is concrete and well-defined, becomes fundamentally ambiguous when we try to apply it to continuous geometric spaces. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox exploits our deep intuition that randomness should be unique and self-evident, that there exists one true way to randomly select something, yet mathematics reveals this assumption to be false. When we think of picking something at random, our minds instinctively assume uniformity and fairness, but uniform distribution across an infinite continuum of possibilities becomes a philosophical nightmare with no clear resolution. What makes this paradox so intellectually unsettling is that we have normalized the uncertainty away, accepting that different, reasonable methods of random selection simply produce different valid answers. rather than demanding that mathematics somehow provide us with a single objective truth about which method is truly random and which are merely pretending to be. The Mpemba paradox emerges from a deceptively simple observation that has puzzled physicists and chemists for decades. Hot water sometimes freezes faster than cold water when both are placed in identical conditions within a freezer. This phenomenon, documented by the Tanzanian student Erasto Mpemba in the 1960s, though observed by Aristotle centuries earlier, presents a direct challenge to our intuitive understanding of thermodynamics and the cooling process. When you place a container of boiling water next to a container of room temperature water in a freezer set to the same temperature, conventional logic suggests the room temperature water should reach the freezing point first, having less thermal energy to lose. Yet observations repeatedly confirm that sometimes, inexplicably, the hot water solidifies into ice before its cooler counterpart completes its transformation. The mechanism behind this counterintuitive behavior involves multiple interconnected factors working in concert. Supercooling effects where cold water remains liquid below its normal freezing point due to a lack of nucleation sites, evaporative cooling which removes more mass from the hot water and therefore requires less subsequent energy loss, convection currents that distribute heat more efficiently in warmer water, and the expansion properties of water near freezing temperatures which affect how quickly ice crystals propagate through the liquid. Some researchers propose that dissolved gases escape more readily from heated water, reducing the resistance to ice formation, while others suggest that hydrogen bonding arrangements differ significantly between hot and cold water in ways that facilitate crystallization. Despite numerous scientific investigations and theoretical frameworks attempting to explain this paradox, no single universally accepted explanation has emerged, and the phenomenon remains inconsistent and dependent on precise experimental conditions. Imagine standing in a market where a vendor offers you two choices: a large, clear bottle of fresh water, or a small diamond of comparable visual clarity and beauty, and yet the diamond costs thousands of times more than the water, despite the fact that you can survive weeks without the diamond but only days without water. And this fundamental inversion of value based on survival necessity versus perceived rarity creates one of the most persistent puzzles in human economics and psychology that has troubled philosophers since ancient times. The water-diamond paradox, first formally articulated by Adam Smith in the 18th century, describes the strange phenomenon where the most essential substances for human survival often command the lowest prices in the marketplace, while luxurious items of minimal practical utility command extraordinary sums. And this paradox persists because we have collectively agreed to separate the concept of use value, which measures how essential something is to our survival and well-being, from exchange value, which measures what someone will actually pay for it in a transaction. Water remains abundant in most developed regions, freely available from taps and natural sources, so its scarcity value approaches zero despite its irreplaceable role in sustaining life itself, whereas diamonds are artificially scarce through mining limitations and careful market control, creating an artificial elevation in price that has nothing to do with their actual utility or necessity for human existence. The psychological mechanism at work involves our tendency to judge value not by intrinsic importance but by relative scarcity and social signals. So a diamond becomes valuable precisely because it is rare and because owning one signals wealth and status to others, while water becomes worthless precisely because it is abundant and everyone already has access to it, and we have normalized this inversion so thoroughly that we find I. Consider the peculiar reality that water, essential for human survival and available in abundance across most of the planet, costs virtually nothing, while diamonds, which serve no biological purpose and exist in finite quantities primarily because of artificial scarcity, command extraordinary prices that can reach thousands of dollars per carat, and this fundamental contradiction in how we assign worth to objects reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of value itself. In the real world, a person dying of thirst in a desert would trade everything they own for a single glass of water. Yet in a functioning market economy, that same person in a city can purchase unlimited water for mere pennies, while a diamond ring might require months of wages, demonstrating that our valuation system operates on principles almost entirely disconnected from actual utility or survival necessity. The mechanism behind this paradox emerges from the distinction between use value and exchange value, concepts that economic theorists have grappled with for centuries. where use value represents what something is genuinely worth to sustaining life and meeting needs, while exchange value represents what society collectively agrees to pay for it in a marketplace driven by scarcity, desirability, status signaling, and psychological attachment rather than practical application. Water's abundance makes it appear worthless despite its irreplaceable importance to existence, while diamonds' rarity, combined with aggressive marketing campaigns that have convinced generations that they symbolize love and commitment, creates perceived value where little practical value exists. And this inversion reveals how human consciousness assigns meaning through social construction rather than rational assessment of actual requirements. Consider the modern supermarket, a cathedral of abundance where entire walls collapse under the weight of identical products, where choice has multiplied to the point of paralysis, and where the cornucopia of human civilization sits glowing under fluorescent light, waiting to be consumed. Yet within this temple of surplus, something profoundly strange occurs. People walk these aisles feeling not satisfied but increasingly anxious, not liberated by options but oppressed by them, experiencing a peculiar form of deprivation that emerges not from scarcity but from excess itself. This is the paradox of plenty, the counterintuitive phenomenon wherein abundance creates the very sense of lack it was designed to eliminate, where the solution becomes indistinguishable from the problem, and where having more somehow leaves us feeling like we have less. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several interconnected psychological pathways that exploit the architecture of human desire and perception. When choices remain limited, the mind develops a clear hierarchy of wants. The available options feel sufficient because there exists no imaginative framework for alternatives beyond them. But as options multiply exponentially, the human cognitive apparatus becomes overwhelmed, and what emerges is not gratitude for abundance, but instead a haunting awareness of infinite paths not taken, infinite selections left unchosen, infinite versions of satisfaction forever locked behind the doors of unchosen possibilities. Each item selected becomes a small death of all the items rejected, and the perfect choice, which theoretically should exist somewhere in this infinite garden, remains perpetually elusive, receding further with every expansion of the available set. Within wealthy nations, a curious observation emerges when economists examine the relationship between individual income and reported happiness. Those with more money tend to report higher levels of life satisfaction than those with less. Yet when we zoom outward to compare entire countries, the nations with the highest average incomes do not necessarily report proportionally higher average happiness levels, and in some cases, they report surprisingly similar or even lower levels of subjective well-being than moderately wealthy nations. This phenomenon, first documented by economist Richard Easterlin in the 1970s, reveals a fundamental disconnect between what we might expect from simple economic logic and what actually occurs in human psychology and social experience. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through the concept of relative deprivation and hedonic adaptation, suggesting that our sense of satisfaction derives not from absolute wealth, but from how our circumstances compare to those around us and to our own expectations. When an individual earns significantly more than their peers and neighbors, the psychological boost is substantial and measurable. Yet when entire societies grow wealthier together, everyone experiences this rise in income simultaneously, meaning the relative positions remain largely unchanged, producing no net gain in collective happiness despite objective improvements in material conditions. Furthermore, as wealth increases across a society, expectations adjust upward accordingly. The luxuries of one generation become the necessities of the next, and this hedonic treadmill ensures that even significant gains in purchasing power fail to translate into sustained increases in reported well-being. The paradox persists stubbornly in modern economies despite decades of research documentation, perhaps because we remain psychologically anchored to the assumption that more money should make us happier. Consider the curious observation that emerged from epidemiological research in the 1980s and 90s, when scientists examining mortality rates across developed nations noticed something peculiar about France that seemed to defy conventional medical wisdom. Despite consuming significantly higher quantities of saturated fats, cheese, butter, and rich foods compared to populations in other Western nations, The French demonstrated notably lower rates of cardiovascular disease and heart attacks than countries like the United States, where dietary guidelines had long emphasized fat restriction and lean proteins. This statistical anomaly became known as the French Paradox, and it troubled the foundations of nutritional science because it suggested that the established relationship between dietary fat consumption and heart disease was not as straightforward as the dominant medical consensus had insisted for decades. Researchers initially proposed various explanations for this phenomenon, attributing it to the consumption of red wine with its resveratrol compounds, or to portion control despite rich ingredients, or to the protective effects of a Mediterranean-influenced diet, yet none of these theories entirely accounted for the magnitude of the protective effect observed in French populations. The deeper mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something profoundly unsettling about scientific certainty and institutional authority, because it demonstrates how entire nutritional frameworks can be constructed and promoted based on incomplete understanding, how populations can be guided towards specific dietary habits based on evidence that later proves far more ambiguous than originally claimed, and how the absence of a clear mechanistic explanation does not prevent the confident assertion of dietary dogma. Consider a statistical anomaly that has puzzled epidemiologists and public health researchers for decades. Despite facing lower average incomes, less access to health care, higher rates of poverty, and reduced educational attainment compared to white Americans, Hispanic populations in the United States consistently demonstrate better health outcomes across numerous categories, including lower rates of heart disease, certain cancers, and infant mortality, while simultaneously reporting higher life expectancy than would be predicted by their socioeconomic status alone. This counterintuitive phenomenon, known as the Hispanic Paradox, presents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of how social determinants translate into health inequities, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the variables we have long considered most predictive of wellness do not always behave as our models suggest they should. The psychological mechanism underlying our confusion about this paradox stems from decades of research establishing that poverty correlates with poor health outcomes, that limited healthcare access diminishes wellness, and that chronic stress from discrimination and marginalization exacts a measurable physiological toll. Yet somehow these established relationships fail to manifest with the severity we would expect when examining Hispanic American populations. Various explanations have been proposed to reconcile this contradiction. Some researchers point to selection effects, suggesting that immigration itself represents a form of positive selection where healthier, more motivated individuals undertake the migration journey. Others highlight the protective effects of family cohesion and cultural values, emphasizing community support and healthier dietary practices rooted in traditional cuisines. Still others propose that the very act of migration and community solidarity generates resilience factors that buffer against the expected he. Consider the strange medical phenomenon that has puzzled cardiologists and epidemiologists for decades. Among patients who already suffer from established heart disease, those classified as overweight or obese sometimes demonstrate better survival rates and lower mortality than their normal weight counterparts, a counterintuitive finding that contradicts everything we understand about the relationship between excess body weight and cardiovascular health. In numerous studies examining patients hospitalized with heart failure, acute coronary syndrome, or chronic cardiovascular disease, researchers have consistently observed that individuals with body mass index values in the overweight to obese range experienced fewer fatal outcomes during follow-up periods compared to those maintaining ideal body weight, creating a profound statistical anomaly that seems to defy logic and established medical knowledge. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several interconnected pathways that slowly reveal why this inversion exists. Patients carrying excess body weight often receive more aggressive medical interventions and monitoring because physicians recognize their elevated risk factors, leading to earlier detection of complications and more frequent medication adjustments. Additionally, the extra metabolic reserves provided by adipose tissue may offer a protective buffer during acute cardiac events, allowing the body additional resources to survive critical periods of physiological stress. Furthermore, selection bias plays a crucial role, as severely ill patients often lose significant weight rapidly during their illness, meaning those classified as obese when measured may have actually been much heavier before decline, skewing comparisons unfairly. Imagine a world where a vaccine program successfully prevents a disease from spreading, where millions of people never experience illness because of a public health intervention that works precisely as intended. Yet the very success of that intervention becomes the source of public doubt and skepticism that gradually erodes the trust in the system that created it. This is the prevention paradox, a phenomenon so counterintuitive that it sits at the heart of how we evaluate the effectiveness of preventive medicine and safety measures, creating a logical trap from which there seems to be no escape. When prevention works, the prevented harm becomes invisible, transformed into a non-event that never enters the realm of human experience or collective memory, while the side effects, the rare complications, and the inconveniences of the preventive measure itself remain tangible and observable. A parent who never sees their child suffer from measles has no visceral reference point for understanding why vaccination matters, only the abstract knowledge that it prevents something they will never witness, while simultaneously having access to stories of adverse reactions that feel immediate and real. The mechanism operates through a fundamental asymmetry in human perception, where absence of harm registers as negligible or even suspicious, whereas presence of any negative outcome registers as proof of danger, creating an impossible standard for any preventive intervention to meet in the eyes of the public. We demand that prevention cause no side effects whatsoever, while simultaneously judging its necessity by the absence of the disease it prevents, a contradiction that ensures preventive measures will always appear less necessary the more successful they become. Consider for a moment the fundamental biology of size and cellular division, a relationship so intuitive that it seems almost self-evident. Larger organisms should develop cancer more frequently than smaller ones, simply because they contain vastly more cells, and cancer arises from the accumulated mutations within cellular lineages. A whale possesses approximately 1,000 times more cells than a human being, which should logically mean it faces roughly 1,000 times greater risk of malignant tumor formation, yet empirical observation reveals something profoundly unsettling. Cancer incidence rates across species do not scale proportionally with body mass at all. Whales and elephants suffer from cancer at rates surprisingly similar to or even lower than humans, despite possessing exponentially greater cell counts, a phenomenon first articulated by the epidemiologist Richard Peto in the 1970s. This observation presents a paradox so troubling that it challenges our understanding of evolutionary biology and cellular mortality itself. The mechanism driving this apparent contradiction remains inadequately explained by conventional oncological theory. Larger organisms must possess superior mechanisms for suppressing tumor formation, detecting aberrant cells, or eliminating cancerous tissue before it proliferates into clinical disease, yet the precise nature of these protective mechanisms eludes complete characterization. Some researchers hypothesize that larger animals have evolved redundant safeguards against malignancy, additional layers of apoptotic programming and genetic surveillance that smaller creatures simply do not require. Others suggest that metabolic rates and cellular division frequencies may play counterintuitive roles in cancer development, such that size alone proves insufficient as a predictive variable. Consider the peculiar situation that unfolds in many democratic societies during times of significant civil unrest or perceived threat to public order, where citizens simultaneously demand both increased security measures from their government and greater protection of their individual freedoms and privacy rights, seemingly unable to recognize that these two desires exist in direct opposition to one another. This phenomenon, known as Lombard's paradox, emerges from the gap between what people claim to value in abstract terms and what they actually support when presented with concrete circumstances that force them to choose between competing goods. The mechanism operates through a kind of cognitive compartmentalization, wherein citizens maintain separate mental frameworks for different aspects of their lives without acknowledging the inherent contradictions between them. Much like how a person might champion privacy rights in principle while eagerly installing surveillance cameras in their neighborhood, or advocate for minimal government intervention while voting for policies that expand state authority over personal behavior. The paradox deepens when we examine the psychological roots of this contradiction, which often trace back to a fundamental human need for safety that temporarily overrides our commitment to abstract ideals when fear becomes sufficiently acute, creating a temporary hierarchy of values that feels entirely rational in the moment. What makes Lombard's paradox particularly insidious is that this contradiction persists across generations and societies despite centuries of philosophical discourse about the necessary trade-offs between security and liberty, suggesting that we have not internalized these lessons in any meaningful way, instead allowing ourselves to be perpetually caught between the desire for a protector and the desire to remain ungoverned. A tension that governments understand far too well and exploit with remarkable. Consider the strange contradiction that lies at the heart of one of Earth's most abundant life forms. Algae simultaneously represents both humanity's most promising solution to climate change and our most stubborn environmental problem. Algae produces roughly half of the oxygen we breathe, grows faster than almost any other organism, requires no arable land or fresh water to cultivate, and can be converted into biofuels, proteins, and countless other valuable compounds that could theoretically replace our dependence on fossil fuels and industrial agriculture. Yet despite possessing these almost miraculous properties, algae remains largely unexploited at any meaningful industrial scale, while we continue investing trillions into infrastructure built on the very resources algae could make obsolete. The paradox deepens when we recognize that algae's exponential growth, which should be celebrated as a renewable resource, instead triggers our deepest environmental anxieties. Algal blooms choke our waterways, deplete oxygen from aquatic ecosystems, and poison drinking water supplies with neurotoxins. We have created a situation where the solution and the problem are literally the same organism, distinguished only by context and concentration. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox involves our fundamental inability to perceive potential in abundance. We struggle to value what appears unlimited or seemingly free, while simultaneously fearing the very proliferation that makes it valuable. Furthermore, our existing infrastructure and economic systems have become so calcified around fossil fuel extraction and industrial monoculture that even recognizing algae's potential requires dismantling decades of investment in power structures. We have normalized this contradiction by compartmentalizing algae into separate narratives. The agricultural crisis, the climate solution, the toxic bloom, the biofuel future, each told in isolation, never ignored. Consider the fundamental paradox that exists at the foundation of our entire oceanic ecosystem, a paradox so pervasive and yet so invisible that we rarely pause to contemplate its implications. Plankton are among the smallest organisms on Earth, individual creatures so microscopic that billions could fit within a single drop of seawater. And yet these infinitesimal beings are responsible for producing somewhere between 50 and 80% of the oxygen that all terrestrial life, including humanity itself, depends upon for survival. They drift passively in the currents, seemingly powerless and insignificant, carried by forces entirely beyond their control, and yet they are simultaneously the most consequential organisms in existence, the primary foundation upon which nearly every marine food chain is constructed, the primary source of food for creatures ranging from small fish to the largest whales that have ever lived. The paradox deepens when we recognize that despite their overwhelming importance to planetary habitability and the continuation of complex life as we know it, plankton remain largely absent from human consciousness, rarely mentioned in educational curricula, seldom discussed in popular media, and virtually invisible to the naked eye. We have built our civilization, our economies, and our sense of control over nature without truly acknowledging our complete and total dependence upon these microscopic organisms that we cannot see, cannot easily study, and cannot directly influence or manipulate. The oxygen we breathe with each moment of every day is a gift from creatures we will never observe directly, and this strange disconnect persists despite centuries of scientific advancement and our ever-increasing knowledge of marine biology. The more stable and secure a system becomes, the more fragile it grows beneath the surface, yet we continue to reinforce it as though invulnerability were being achieved. Consider the modern financial system, which has built layer upon layer of safeguards, regulations, and fail-safes designed to prevent collapse, and yet this very architecture of protection creates hidden dependencies and systemic vulnerabilities that few understand until catastrophe arrives. A bank protected by deposit insurance, emergency liquidity protocols, and government backing feels safer to the depositor. But this sense of safety encourages people to ignore warning signs and concentrate their trust in institutions that have become so interconnected that the failure of one threatens to unravel all others. The psychological mechanism at work is deceptively simple. As we add more mechanisms of control and stability to a system, we become progressively less aware of its actual fragility because the appearance of stability itself becomes the primary experience, not the underlying health of the structure. The security we feel is almost entirely divorced from the security that actually exists, and this gap widens precisely because we have invested so heavily in creating visible reassurances. A nation at peace and economically prosperous believes itself fundamentally stable, while the seeds of political polarization, wealth inequality, and institutional decay multiply quietly beneath prosperity's surface, and citizens feel less urgency to address these problems because everything appears secure. We normalize this disconnection so thoroughly that questioning stability itself feels paranoid or unnecessary, and we have come to define stability not as actual resilience, but as the absence of immediate visible threat. Consider the person who spends their evening meticulously organizing their desk, color-coding their calendar, and planning out every hour of the coming week with rigid precision, believing that this elaborate structure will somehow shield them from uncertainty and give them dominion over their own life. Yet the moment an unexpected email arrives or a friend cancels plans, all of this carefully constructed architecture crumbles, and they find themselves experiencing profound anxiety despite having invested hours in the illusion of control. This is the control paradox, and it operates on a principle so counterintuitive that most people never notice it is happening. The more energy we devote to controlling our circumstances, attempting to predict outcomes and eliminate variables, the more fragile our sense of security becomes, because we are fundamentally building our peace of mind on the impossible premise that the world can be rendered predictable through sufficient effort and vigilance. The psychological mechanism beneath this paradox rests on a particular kind of cognitive trap where the attempt to control generates an invisible dependency on that control continuing indefinitely. We convince ourselves that our safety comes from our planning, our systems, our preparation, but in doing so we train our nervous system to feel threatened the moment something falls outside our designed parameters. The person who leaves nothing to chance becomes someone who is constantly threatened by chance. What makes this particularly paradoxical is that the very act of seeking control undermines the genuine resilience and adaptability that would actually protect us in an uncertain world. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly that we celebrate its symptoms as virtues, treating obsessive planning and meticulous management as signs of responsibility and maturity, rather than as symptoms of a deeper anxiety that builds with every attempt to eliminate unpredicta. Consider the peculiar situation that emerges whenever someone attempts to recover from a difficult experience, whether that experience takes the form of addiction, trauma, heartbreak, or any other profound disruption to their sense of stability and well-being. The paradox reveals itself in a striking contradiction. The very act of recovery requires the person to confront and relive the painful memories and experiences they are trying to escape from, which means that in order to move forward, they must temporarily move backward into the darkness they are fleeing. This creates an impossible bind where healing demands that we wound ourselves again, where progress requires regression, and where the path to wholeness necessitates returning to brokenness. The therapist's office becomes a place where we must narrate our suffering anew, where the addiction counselor's question forces us to articulate the exact behaviors we are trying to abandon, and where support groups gather people together to speak their pain aloud repeatedly, almost as if the speaking itself might transform it through some alchemy of shared witness. Yet the mechanism behind this paradox operates on a neurological and psychological principle that we now understand quite well. Trauma and difficult experiences become integrated into our neural pathways in fragmented, sensory, and often nonverbal ways, and the only pathway to genuine healing involves accessing those fragments directly, bringing them into conscious awareness, naming them with language, and slowly integrating them into a coherent narrative of self. Without this confrontation, the unprocessed material remains buried beneath the surface, erupting at unexpected moments through symptoms, avoidance behaviors, and a persistent sense that something remains unresolved. Consider the moment when something goes wrong in a commercial transaction, when a product fails to meet expectations or a service falls short of what was promised, and the business responds not with mere apology, but with extraordinary compensation designed to win back your trust and loyalty. This is the service recovery paradox, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about human psychology and consumer behavior that most people never consciously acknowledge. Research has repeatedly demonstrated that customers who experience a failure followed by effective recovery often report higher satisfaction and loyalty than those who had no problem in the first place, creating a counterintuitive scenario where businesses might theoretically benefit from occasionally allowing failures to occur. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several overlapping psychological processes, beginning with what researchers call the contrast effect, where the dramatic reversal from disappointment to delight creates a more emotionally intense experience than steady competence ever could, thereby embedding itself more deeply into memory and sentiment. Additionally, when a company recovers from a failure effectively, it signals several powerful messages simultaneously: that the organization cares enough to fix mistakes, that you as a customer matter enough to warrant special attention, and perhaps most importantly, that the company is confident enough in its overall quality to weather criticism and respond generously rather than defensively. This sense of being valued, combined with the relief of resolution, can actually strengthen the psychological bond between consumer and brand more effectively than the careful avoidance of problems altogether. The paradox deepens when we acknowledge that this phenomenon has become normalized within business practices, with many companies now viewing occasional service failures as manageable and even straight. Consider the modern knowledge worker who finds themselves trapped in an increasingly familiar and yet deeply unsettling situation. The more tools they acquire to save time, the less free time they actually possess, and the harder they work to increase their output, the more demands placed upon them seem to expand in direct proportion to their efficiency gains. This is the productivity paradox, a phenomenon so deeply embedded in our contemporary work culture that we have ceased to question its fundamental contradiction. A person implements a new project management application designed to streamline their workflow and eliminate unnecessary steps, yet within weeks they find themselves spending additional hours maintaining the application itself, attending training sessions, and adapting their existing processes to accommodate the new system's requirements. Meanwhile, the actual time devoted to meaningful work has mysteriously contracted rather than expanded. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through what economists call Jevons Paradox, named after the 19th century observation that as efficiency improvements made coal production cheaper, overall coal consumption paradoxically increased rather than decreased, because cheaper coal enabled entirely new industries and applications to emerge. In the workplace, this translates into an endless cycle where any productivity gain becomes an invitation for additional responsibility, tighter deadlines, and expanded scope, rather than a genuine reduction in workload or pressure. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that workers now experience a peculiar form of cognitive dissonance. They simultaneously acknowledge that their productivity tools make them less productive while continuing to adopt more of them, as though the next application, the next methodology, or the next efficiency framework might finally break the cycle. Consider the peculiar situation in which a person invests tremendous time, energy, and resources into preparing for a future catastrophe, only to discover that their very act of preparation somehow diminishes the likelihood of that catastrophe ever occurring, which in turn creates a psychological conflict where they cannot determine whether their preparation was necessary or if they wasted their effort on something that would never have happened anyway. This is the preparedness paradox, a curious loop of causality and perception that traps us between two equally unsatisfying conclusions. When a homeowner installs an expensive security system, studies crime statistics obsessively, reinforces their locks, and trains their family in emergency procedures, they may indeed experience fewer break-ins over the following years, yet they will never know if the crime would have occurred without their preparations, or if the neighborhood was always safe and their anxiety was unfounded from the beginning. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our inability to access counterfactual realities where we made different choices, creating a permanent epistemic fog that surrounds the true necessity of our precautions. We exist in only one timeline, and we experience only the outcomes of the choices we actually made, never the alternatives. Furthermore, this paradox is compounded by what we might call the defensive pessimist's dilemma. The more thoroughly someone prepares, the safer they become, yet the safer they become, the easier it is to convince themselves that they overprepared, that they were anxious without cause, that they wasted resources on imaginary threats. This leads many people to gradually abandon their preparedness measures, only to occasionally experience the exact event they once feared, at which point they resume their preparations with renewed vigor and the whole cycle begins anew. Consider the ecosystem manager or conservation biologist who arrives with the best intentions, seeking to improve the health of a struggling natural system by introducing abundant resources, more nutrients, greater biodiversity, or increased food sources into an environment that has been degraded or depleted. The logic seems unassailable. If a system is suffering from scarcity, surely abundance will restore it to vitality and stability. Yet what often emerges instead is ecological collapse, a phenomenon so counterintuitive that it has become known as the paradox of enrichment, a concept first articulated through mathematical models examining predator-prey dynamics in aquatic systems. When resources become too plentiful too quickly, the delicate balance that evolution has calibrated over millennia begins to fracture in unexpected ways. Predator populations explode in response to the sudden feast, but their numbers overshoot the sustainable carrying capacity of their prey, leading not to harmony, but to violent population fluctuations that can drive species toward extinction. The enriched system becomes unstable precisely because stability itself requires constraint, requires the tension between scarcity and survival that has shaped every organism's behavior and reproductive strategy. What we witness here is the uncomfortable truth that excess can be as destabilizing as deprivation, that the absence of struggle can paradoxically create conditions for catastrophe rather than flourishing. We have normalized the assumption that more is always better, that enrichment is inherently corrective, yet the natural world demonstrates repeatedly that systems require friction, limitation, and the pressure of competition to maintain coherence. This paradox whispers an unsettling suggestion about our own attempts to engineer prosperity and improvement, hinting that our grandest interventions may contain within them the seeds of their own undoing. Consider the strange observation that most of your friends have more friends than you do, a phenomenon that seems to contradict the natural distribution of social connections across any population, yet persists as a documented reality in human social networks both online and offline. This paradox emerges not from any deficiency in your social awareness or capability, but rather from a mathematical peculiarity in how friendship networks naturally organize themselves around highly connected individuals who inevitably appear in the friend lists of many people, while isolated or moderately social people appear in far fewer friend lists, creating an asymmetry that skews perception when you examine your own circle. The mechanism operates through a selection bias that is entirely invisible to us as we live within it. For when you look at your friends, you are by definition looking at people who have chosen to maintain connection with you, and people who maintain many connections are statistically more likely to appear in any given person's social network than people who maintain few connections. Much like how if you poll airline passengers about the average number of seats on planes they have flown, the result will be inexplicably higher than the actual average, because people who fly on larger planes represent themselves multiple times in the statistics. The paradox reveals itself as fundamentally unavoidable within any realistic social structure, not because friendship itself works differently than we imagine, but because our sample size is inherently biased toward the more social members of our networks, and this creates a persistent cognitive dissonance where we cannot help but feel slightly inadequate when we observe that our friends seem to know more people than we do. A feeling that becomes normalized and internalized as we mature into adulthood and develop social anxiety, rooted not in actual isolation, but in this mathematically inevitable